The municipalities that have previously relied on groundwater have switched to surface water in the recent past as their primary drinking water source. But some of those municipalities would like to at least be able to access some of their groundwater and are testing new treatment systems to enable that use. There was an issue recently that came up, a fairly significant one, where a number of the municipalities, after a year of shutting in their wells, wanted to do their annual maintenance on those wells and develop those wells and discharge that water. That became an issue in terms of discharge to groundwater, and the Water Quality Control Division staff handled that internally. But again, this question of whether they should be permitting discharges to groundwater came up. So we see that issue coming up in different areas as well. The state engineer, this is a significant issue actually. In Division 2, the state engineer ordered the lowering of the Cacharis No. 5 dam, which is a dam that has long had some problems, structural problems. It's an old dam. It was constructed in 1913, and to my knowledge, it's the first dam that the state engineer's office has ordered to be essentially deconstructed. And so they're taking 55 feet of the dam down and leaving the lower part of that dam because over the years it's filled with sediment, and we don't want to remove that and have that be a continual source of sediment to the stream. And in this process, the state engineer's office has been operating on a nationwide stream rehabilitation permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. That work, I think it was ongoing 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure if they have finished yet or not. So, no, I don't think so. I think it's DWR actually took control of the site and hired a contractor to do the deconstruction work. So that should be ongoing. Yeah. Unless the Army Corps of Engineers needed to have staff there and they weren't able to be there. So like I said, I haven't heard in the last couple of weeks. If you'd like to know, I can touch base with our staff down there and get a message to you later. Yeah. Division 2 staff identified 2 illegally filled ponds in the Fountain Creek Basin on Cottonwood Creek near Colorado Springs. Those ponds were ordered drained by the state engineer, and this happens from time to time. And usually in every report I give you that we have situations like this where the state engineer tells them, look, you have to release that water for water rights downstream. And so a breach of those ponds is made. And usually in those circumstances, we cooperate with the Water Quality Control Division and CPW on making sure that the silt is controlled well enough so that's not an issue for aquatic life and the standards downstream. Division 3, the Rio Grande Basin. 2018, the SCO notified both CDPHE and CPW of potential water quality issues related to the draining of several reservoirs. It was a warm year this past year, dry year, especially in the southern part of the state. And so these reservoirs were drained down to base level. And so during that process, you start entraining more sediment, and that becomes an issue. And again, Water Quality Control Division and CPW were notified of these potential water quality issues at Mountain Home Reservoir, Smith Reservoir, and Rio Grande Reservoir, and no issues were noted in the draining of those reservoirs. Lastly, in Division 4, in September and October of 2017, the Peonia Reservoir dam was needed to be rehabilitated at the outlet works. Significant amount of sediment was going to be released. They did a lot of work in modeling the fate and transport of that sediment during that time frame of the work, and worked with a number of agencies, including Water Quality Control Division, Parks and Wildlife, Army Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, and USGS to monitor what actually happened in terms of the fate and transport of that sediment. And so a lot of data was collected, but by all accounts, no issues were generated during that work. Sorry, and lastly, in the Colorado River Basin, there's an annual flushing of the Shoshone and Cameo dams, and one of the changes this year is the Cameo Dam was addressed during a low flow period at the end of October. And so some silt did go down to the river through mid-October, but again, no serious downstream contamination issues. That concludes the report. I'll entertain any questions you might have.
Thank you, Matt. Questions? Thank you very much for your report.
And this is kind of from my own education, I think, but with the reservoir and dam maintenance and releases, the primary authority there is State Engineer's Office in conjunction with Corps of Engineers, typically? Or
if it's a Corps of Engineer dam, yes.
Okay.
If it's a federal dam facility, they would be involved. This one at Kucharis was built, I think, by Bureau of Reclamation in 1913, so they were involved in that.
So then, and this may be a question for Patrick or Tricia, so then is the coordination with the Water Quality Control Division, is it a courtesy coordination, or is there a formal process, or is it, because I don't know where that is in our regulations. Yeah, for maintenance.
So Amy might be able to answer this, but I'm assuming there'd be a 401 certification for us on the dam removal.
Yeah, sometimes there's a 401 nexus, so that we'll work with our 401 team. Other times there's not a 401 nexus, and it's just more so to alert us on what could happen. And mostly what we'll do is work with CPW to say that they'll have the biologist on site just to make sure if there is some sort of release or impacts to the product that they're being addressed in that way. But it's more so to let us know so that we can be tracking, and if we get calls, then we can coordinate with these guys.
And we do have an MOU in place that addresses this specific issue.
Exactly.
I guess that's what my question was where is the guidance on that topic, and it's an MOU. Okay.
Kevin?
So I don't know if you were here earlier, but we talked a little bit about GIS with
Yes.
oil and public safety and hazardous waste. And I know you guys have your own GIS with all the wells. I remember historically, you don't have any information related to well closures. Is that still, like, generally no one reports that a well is no longer used. So a lot of times that data has a significant number of unused wells. Is that still the case?
Technically, they should be reporting that on an abandonment report. We do have a process for that work done, essentially plugging and abandoning water wells to be reported to us. That's a requirement. And if it's not being done, there's a violation. This is one of those difficult things where how do you identify where there's a violation when you have no information that the well's been closed. Yeah, that our database will have some of those. And if you go on the ground, maybe it has been abandoned, but the people doing the work of that abandonment either have to be a licensed contractor or an authorized individual, which would be a professional engineer or a professional geologist. And all of those folks professionally, if they don't report their abandonment to water quality control, are taking their professional license registration at risk for not actually completing those documents. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does to an extent. Do you have any idea of, I guess I would say, whether it's a significant number of those wells or? You know,
I would say in terms of water supply wells, it's probably minimal because we do have professionals that are doing that work and they generally know the rules. In terms of monitoring wells and monitoring holes, I think there's more of a problem in that regard. And any assistance from our sister agencies like OPS would be helpful in that regard. I know that they require the contractors that they're working with to follow our rules. So, yeah.
Thank you for your report.
Thank you.
Next, we have the Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety.
You get another chair? I don't go anywhere without them. Okay, members of the commission? Good morning. I'm Jenny Brandon. I'm Division Director for Reclamation, Mining, and Safety. Thank you for having us here this morning. We are here pursuant to the Senate Bill 181 amendments and to further our joint commitment to protect groundwater and comply with state water quality standards. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to go minerals program, coal program, inactive mines program, and they are each, Russ Means, Jim Stark, Jeff Graves, are going to give you an overview of their program and then give you a couple of examples of, how are we protecting groundwater? How are we complying with state water quality standards? And then we'll just take any questions. All right, thank you.
Hello, I'm Russ Means with the Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety with the Minerals Program. As you know, DRMS analyzes the operations that have the potential to be classified as designated mining operations to ensure that their operations are protective of groundwater. We also require non-DMO mining operations, including some aggregate operations, to initiate groundwater sampling where there's a potential for impacts to groundwater. As of this report, we have 34 sites that are being reported under 181. 29 of those are hard rock, as well as 5 of them being construction materials. Because the reports and stuff for 2016 and 17 and 17 and 18 are very, very similar, I'm just going to highlight the 17-18 report and pick a couple of them, and we can go from there. One of the ones I want to highlight for you is the Schwarzwälder mine. It's located in Jefferson County. In 2018, actually, Colorado Legacy Lands took over succession of operator of that site. Over in 2018, they actually brought on the line a new water treatment facility. And along with that, they were able to decommission the old one, and it has been demolished. They are working on the alluvial issues and stuff that are around the mine. There's a potential, they think, that there is some uranium ore or waste and stuff that's affecting the groundwater and the alluvium outside the mine. So they're going to be excavating that material out to see if that has any kind of potential to help reduce the uranium and other constituents and stuff within there are concerns and stuff there. Another site that I wanted to talk about really briefly is the Fortune Revenue Mine. The Fortune Revenue Mine is actually located in Ouray County. DRMS and CDPHE approved a passive water treatment system for the water coming out of that mine. Currently, the mine is not doing any development mining, and the mill is not operating. However, monitoring and sampling is continuing, and the passive system that's been put into place actually looks like it's we're having some favorable results there. The next site that I want to talk about is the Climax Molybdenum Mine. DRMS, CDPHE, and the operator have been continuing to work towards establishing some kind of NPLs and or moving towards rulemaking. This has been a long process, and we continue to work on that. The primary constituents of stuff that we're working on there is manganese and that, but we have had numerous meetings on that, and we continue to work our way towards that. And the fourth site I would like to talk about is the Holcomb Botchart Quarry. At that site, we have a barium issue. It's a cement kiln dust deposit area, and they have with barium. There's been some discussions about whether that is actually a pre-existing condition or not. The operator's consultant has come forward and talked to the CDPHE and the division about using a tritium dating concept for aging that water. Both divisions, both agencies are taking a look at that, and the end game there is hopefully to try to figure out whether this was a pre-existing condition, so that and if it is, then we can go towards final release, and if not, then what our next steps are. So with that, I will turn it over to the Coal program and Jim Stark, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Jim Stark, Director of the Coal program. The Coal program has a lot of groundwater protections, and it's all written into the Colorado Surface Coal Mining Reclamation Act. Currently, we have 6 producing sites and 17 other sites that are in some form of reclamation, encompassing a little bit over 168,000 acres of permitted area. One of the requirements is for baseline groundwater information for every site prior to permitting or prior to any major expansion of that site. The requirement is for a minimum of 4 consecutive quarters of groundwater data, groundwater baseline data. In the last year, we had 3 major permitting actions. One was at the Colawile mine. It was a permit revision that added approximately 15,000 acres. We had the West Elk mine that added approximately 2,500 acres. And then we had the Foydale Creek mine that added approximately 800 acres. So prior to permitting or approving a permit revision for these sites, they had to have this minimum 4 quarters worth of consecutive groundwater data. The next thing that we require is an extensive groundwater monitoring program at every site until final termination of jurisdiction. And again, this is on a minimum quarterly basis, depending on what we determine during our reviews. Some sites, we require monthly data for certain parameters at certain locations. And again, these requirements become a binding part of their permit. And the results of these are submitted annually to the division in what are called annual hydrology reports. So these reports are then reviewed by division hydrologists to ensure protection of groundwater. And currently it's what we call AHR season. AHRs are due in February of every year, I'm sorry. So they're starting to roll in right now. So we're starting to review those for the past year, which would be the 2018 water year. The next thing is all sites are required to have a groundwater point of compliance. And that's one point, or it could be multiple points. It's a point before the water leaves the site, before the groundwater will leave the site, to ensure that there are no adverse impacts to groundwater from the mine site. And again, these are monitored on a regular basis. And then this is the point we use before we terminate jurisdiction to ensure that groundwater has been protected. You know, one of the last sites we did was Colawile. They currently actually have 2 groundwater points of compliance because they're in 2 separate basins. So they're kind of main mining, which is the Colawile pit, the South Taylor pit, that has 1 point of compliance. Their new column pit has a 2nd point of compliance. A lot of sites only have 1. It just depends on the way it's situated. Again, our hydrologists look at everything and determine if they need 1 or multiple points of compliance. The final thing we do is we assess groundwater quality before we terminate jurisdiction on a site. And that goes back, we go back and we look at all of the quarterly and yearly hydrologic data. We look at the data from the point of compliance. And then in our written finding document, we are required to make a finding that there has been no adverse impacts to groundwater through the life of the mining operation. And to date, we have terminated jurisdiction on 79 sites. The most recent was just this last fall. We terminated jurisdiction on the Munger Canyon mine, which was about 2,000 acres. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeff.
Good morning. Jeff Graves with the Inactive Mine Reclamation Program. I think on here it's actually shown as the Abandoned Mine Land Program, and we'll go by either name. Just to give you a little bit of a kind of history of who we are with respect to the division. We handle abandoned mine related issues, and in our world, abandoned mines are really anything prior to 1977, specifically with our funding that is derived from SMACRA, or Surface Mining Reclamation Control Act. We do have a lot of interaction with respect to reclamation on abandoned mines and non-point source related issues. Our program receives funding, severance tax funding, and then also works with partner agencies, both Forest Service, BLM, EPA, the Health Department on occasion. And then also we have recently worked with some private organizations, both Newmont and Freeport-McMoRan, to conduct reclamation activities on historic or abandoned mines, trying to improve water quality by addressing non-point source related issues. And so this last year, in 2018, we completed 4 reclamation projects on sites. Those are listed, I think, up on the screen. I'll just kind of highlight those 4 sites. The Mountain Pride Mine, we worked with Trout Unlimited and with the Colorado Department of Health and Environment, the 319 program. We provided funding, and then Trout Unlimited managed the project there. It's in Illinois Gulch, just outside of Breckenridge. And that was to address some water quality related issues downstream, where you had water running over exposed mine waste and leaching out metals. So that project was completed in 2018. We also worked with the Clear Creek Watershed Foundation on the Lower North Empire Creek Restoration Project. We provided severance tax funding as match for the 319 grant that they received to improve water quality within that North Empire Creek section there. They did some waste pile capping, some redirection of surface flows around waste rock piles. We also worked with Freeport-McMoRan, a pretty significant project there on their property outside of Mount Emmons. The Mount Emmons property, we did some, not tailings, it was actually waste rock capping at the level 1370 and 1670 to redirect surface flows around waste rock, cap exposed waste rock, and then do some revegetation. We also partnered with Trout Unlimited on that project and completed that in 2018. And then the final project on there you'll see is the Standard Mine Level 5 and 98. And so we worked in conjunction with the Forest Service to do some final cleanup work around the Standard Mine, once again capping exposed waste rock and redirecting surface flows around those waste rock piles. And then just to highlight a couple of projects within our kind of ongoing investigations and characterization. 2 projects specifically, the Roy Prairie Mine Pool investigation. This was a bulkhead constructed back in the early 2000s on the Roy Prairie Mine, which is in Henson Creek, just to the west of Lake City on Palmetto Gulch. And the bulkhead was constructed there, valves were closed. Eventually those penetrations in the bulkhead were grouted, but subsequent to that grouting, we had no way to determine what the mine pool elevation was, because there was no pressure transducer installed behind the bulkhead, because it was prior to that being generally kind of our engineered process. So this last year, we actually drilled a well into that mine pool so that we had good mine pool data moving forward to understand what the fluctuation in that mine pool elevation was, and then to understand the chemistry, because there was some concern that that bulkhead had formed a mine pool that was influencing Palmetto Gulch negatively from a water quality standpoint. And so we wanted to have some good information to understand the interaction between that bulkhead and the subsequent mine pool and any creek discharge. So that was installed this last year, and we should have some good data moving forward in terms of what that fluctuation is. Also, we continue monitoring the Pennsylvania mine. 3 bulkheads were installed there. I believe the final bulkhead was installed in 2016. All the valves are closed, and we've been working with USGS to monitor downstream water quality to see what kinds of improvements or potentially any impacts related to that mine pool. Over the last 2 years, monitoring from USGS has indicated that there's been a 33% reduction in zinc load downstream of the Pennsylvania mine, which is a pretty significant improvement from our standpoint. We're very pleased with that. We've also seen a 60% reduction in load from lead, and then a really significant reduction in load from iron, almost 90%. And then a pH rise of about 0.4, which is pretty significant for that creek there. So the pH has been closer to 5 as opposed to 4.5. So continue to monitor that mine pool and see what kind of interaction it has there with the creek, and see if we have any kind of long-term continued improvement or if we're starting to level off with respect to improvement. Also want to highlight DRMS's participation in the Mine Impacted Stream Task Force. This was a task force formed following Gold King with CDPHE, and that was a report I believe I gave 2 years ago here where we did a draining mines inventory within the state. And so that was kind of a product of that task force. One of the new efforts that we're kind of looking at pursuing is trying to do a statewide, as best as we can, inventory of non-point source related issues on a watershed by watershed basis. A lot of this work has already been done, so hopefully some of this will just be compiling that work into more of a statewide database similar to our draining mines inventory, just to give us a sense of what kinds of non-point source issues we have throughout the state that are mining related, and then some, I guess, more of a statewide clearinghouse where people can go to get that information to thereby potentially propose new non-point source related projects, or just to give us a better idea of what we have on a statewide basis. So I think that's all I have. If there's any questions, I guess, for any of us.
Members of the commission, if there are any questions?
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to comment that that's a really nice list of watershed groups that you've worked with. There's 17 listed there with technical assistance, which is nice to see. And then I just had a question whether you had any comments on the Good Samaritan legislation topic related to mine cleanups, since that's been a topic that we've had here.
I mean, we're certainly a proponent of Good Sam legislation. Obviously, the devil's in the details in terms of what it covers and what protection it provides, but we're certainly a proponent of that and feel like, you know, Good Sam legislation would certainly provide more opportunities for states and nonprofits to conduct cleanup activities without incurring liability.
That's a good caveat, Jeff. The good Sam.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I'll echo what Jeff said. We're certainly supportive of that too, depending on how it's developed, and it's still looking again more like a Colorado specific pilot program that they may try and engage in. At least that was the Tipton Gardner amendment that they had just submitted, well, before the government shut down, whenever that was. So we very much support that as well. Along the same lines, I'm trying to work with EPA to get better comfort letters, or, you know, figure out how that, you know, what formerly was our MOU with them for watershed groups and the work that they're doing, so that it does give us better comfort. You know, I don't feel that the current letter in its current iteration is necessarily giving us that. So we're hoping to be able to, once they get back to work, you know, continue those conversations. But the last I had heard from EPA Region 8 is they were supportive of that. So we'll just need to wait until they get back. Otherwise, I think for both watershed groups, for you all, for us, you know, there is some potential exposure there, both on the CERCLA and the Clean Water Act side. And I want to make sure that we're at least clear with respect to CERCLA liability, you know, how far that extends and what EPA is going to be willing to provide us by way of support.
And if I could,
Fred.
go ahead.
On the abandoned mines program, in the past, it seems like there's been a mixture of views on the success of bulkheads, but you guys have had quite a bit of success with that. Is that just mainly understanding the geology and the technical aspects of it, or would you comment on success of bulkheads? Thanks.
I think it's certainly site specific. I mean, there's plenty of examples where bulkheads have been unsuccessful, but I think it's certainly site specific, and there needs to be sufficient research and investigation prior to installing the bulkhead to understand what the potential impacts will be. I certainly don't think in any instance we would advertise that a bulkhead provides the same level of protection that a water treatment plant does, but in certain circumstances they can be successful in reducing loads.
You had something, Jenny?
Oh, members of the commission, I was just going to add that we've been sort of serving as staff to Senators Bennett, Senator Gardner, Gardner and Representative Tipton on Good Sam. And so periodically over the years, and it kind of ebbs and flows, as you know, they reach out, and then we usually get together with CDPHE Water Quality and usually get back to them the same day with the response. So we know they're moving fast when they're moving, and we try and respond in real time. So I just wanted to let you know we've been sort of more than passive onlookers.
Thank you. Commissioner Menzer raised the issue of Good Samaritan legislation last month, and we've started to look at language that we might consider as a resolution from this board to our congressional delegation supporting in some enabling legislation, at least on a pilot program. So if you would coordinate with Tricia, I think that it might be helpful to make sure that the direction you're going is the same that we might consider in a resolution.
Sure. Just one other question for Russ on Schwarzwalder. I know early on there was some discussion of taking some of that waste rock that was in the, well, it's in the alluvium, but just right, outside of the Steve level and down towards the creek and putting that back in the mine. Just what's the current thinking on that? And then how is the uranium levels trending since they've been doing the treatment at the mine?
Overall, is that on? There we go. They started working on that, the alluvium project in the last couple of months. So we're not going to be able to see any kind of results on that until probably sometime this next spring or summer as they're working through that. The trending
sorry to interrupt, but is the thought with that to put that alluvium material back in the mine, or what?
Yes, up above any kind of levels and stuff where it would be in contact with the mine pool at the above the Steve level. What's great. Referred to as the Steve level. Yep. So, but that's the idea, is to excavate out that material that has potential of having uranium low grade ores and and pull it back out, so that if there's any interaction between the groundwater and the creek and everything, that they're removing that source. So, but they have commenced that project, and that's a positive, and we're looking forward to seeing those results. Overall, the mine pool, they've been submitting their data, and we have been watching, and some of the trends for some of the constituents are going down. Others have been, it's a mixed bag. But we are watching it, and the most important thing is that by keeping the mine pool down below the Steve level, I think 150 feet or less, or than that, there's no interaction between that and any kind of groundwater flow that's going into the creek. So they did a technical revision, and staff has been reviewing that. Part of that is to maybe actually drop the pumps down a little bit farther down and do some more injection. They're trying to see if the circulation of the inoculates and stuff that they're putting into the pool maybe aren't being trapped up higher. So they're trying to pull them down in deeper in that. So we are looking at that technical revision right now.
Great. Thanks for all your efforts on that. That's a major impact to Ralston Reservoir. So obviously an important one for us.
Great. Thank you.
Following up on that, do I understand your table correctly that you've installed an RO system at the Schwarzwalder?
There was an RO system and stuff that was already there, and it was kind of it was outdated. So, but what they did with the new system, in that it incorporates, they can actually go back into RO if they need to, but it's kind of a backup system now.
Anything else? Thank you very much for your report.
Thank you.
Last but not least, we have the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. No protection, you're just going to go at a
Now I see it. Good morning. I'm Greg Duranlo. I'm the environmental manager at the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Thanks for putting this together today. I've found the format with the other reporting agencies really valuable to hear what's going on in their world as well. And And I'm not alone. I did bring several COGCC staff members. I have the location assessment specialist with me, John Noto, the East and West environmental supervisors, John Axelson and Alex Fisher, our environmental database manager, Arthur Kepsel, and our current acting interim director, Mike Leonard. Last year, I was here with Matt Lepore. He tendered his resignation, and Julie Murphy was our director for 2018, and she is out on maternity leave, and so Mike Leonard has stepped in to fill those shoes. At any rate, I'm going to give you an introduction to our agency, which most of you have heard from year to year, but I think will be also valuable for the other agencies. I'll talk about some of the policy things that went on in our agency this year, talk about our groundwater sampling data management program, and then go through quickly a couple of just case studies from this year. And let's see if I can run the slideshow. So far, so good. So first, just an introduction to COGCC. Our mission is to foster the responsible, balanced development of oil and gas resources, protect the public health, safety, and welfare, including the environment and wildlife resources, protect correlative rights, other owners of mineral resources, and to prevent waste. Our agency has been acting out this mission or its precursors for since 1951. Our current commission is a 9-member panel appointed by the governor with a variety of statutory background specifics, and including some have to be from the west of the Continental Divide. There can't be a significant imbalance in political party. We have to have a elected official, one with formal training in environmental or wildlife protection, soil conservation, and an agricultural production and royalty owner, and also 3 with significant oil and gas experience. Also, the directors of the Department of Natural Resources and the director of CDPHE sit on our commission. From a staff perspective, we currently have 117 full-time employees working to carry out our mission, and 21 of those are in the environmental unit. The environmental unit is sort of the primary focus of the implementation of the groundwater standards and classifications through the Senate Bill 89-181. And our responsibilities include specifically management and oversight of E&P waste activities, including the oversight of spills and remediations, response to complaints alleging water impacts or soil impacts from E&P waste management or oil and gas activities, and conducting environmental studies. And we also, in the location group, permit the surface locations through the Form 2A process. So where we are in Colorado this year, 53,470 active oil and gas wells, and that's actually down from prior years. The industry still drilled almost 1,700 wells this year, but they also plugged out about 3,200 aging old vertical wells as they were implementing their horizontal programs, specifically in the DJ Basin in Weld County here in the Northern Front Range. Our staff conducted 27,500 inspections of those facilities. Those inspections include, initial construction stormwater inspections, similar to what your inspectors do. Also, drilling and completion oversight inspections, production inspections, plugging and abandonment inspections, environmental inspections, and reclamation inspections. Our field staff and our environmental staff are spread out throughout the state so they can be on scene as necessary in a short amount of time. This year is going to set records for production, although all our production records aren't in. There's a lag in reporting, about 3 months. We are anticipating 158 million barrels, which is significantly higher than previous years, and $15 billion in revenue from oil and gas in the state. This graph, you've seen it the last couple of years. I still think it's a really valuable representation of what's going on in the state. From 2009 to 2018, I just keep adding years to it. The back bars show all permits that COGCC has approved. The middle bars, the lighter colored ones there, show horizontal permits, and the front bars show horizontal wells. So what you see is horizontal well permits make up a much more significant percentage of the permits that we process. Therefore, we are processing a lower number of permits. The horizontal wells develop a larger amount of acreage per well. And then operators are still only drilling a third or so of the permits that they get approved. So they're holding those other permits in reserve. It's, for their financials, et cetera. 92% of those horizontal wells are spud in Weld County. Getting into the meat of what we like to talk about here, or don't like to talk about, the spills and releases and remediations. This year, 586 spills were reported to the COGCC, resulting in 683 new remediations, new cleanups, and we closed 659 remediations, which was a good year for getting sites to closure. Why there are more remediations than spills, we also require operators to submit a investigation and remediation plan for closure of certain facilities. So many facilities associated with those plugged wells are getting closed out, and that requires that plan to be submitted, and so we count that. Many of the spills are actually closed without a formal remediation project. They're just done through the normal course of the spill reporting. So this was a fairly quiet year in terms of our SB 89-181 obligations. However, it was a pretty active policy year for COGCC. Recently, our agency completed a school setbacks rulemaking. This was a pretty hot topic for us. It was initiated in late 2017 by petition by a group called LOGIC, or the League of Oil and Gas Impacted Coloradans. They proposed a setback to school property lines. We previously had on the books a setback to schools as the building was defined. And obviously, students and faculty are outside of the confines of the building using other areas, athletic fields, playgrounds. And they just felt like this was a shortcoming in our rules. And they proposed this rulemaking. Staff supported changing, coming up with a changed rule for this. We recognize the same shortcoming there, but the proposal, as LOGIC put it, was difficult for us to work with. So we put forward our own recommendation that had a little bit more nuance and didn't just define it to the property lines, but actually looked at the areas that students used on a regular basis, so that a school district couldn't buy 40 acres, put a school on it, and then have a setback from that 40 acres or things like that that would be fairly obstructionist to future development. Through the stakeholder meetings, we found that there was good buy-in from school districts, from environmental groups, from LOGIC, and from industry on getting something done. It was an exciting rulemaking from a lot of for that factor, that we had a really good, kind of opposition groups working together very productively. So staff put together a recommendation. The stakeholder process took off. A lot of meetings outside of the confines of our agency, and the stakeholders came back to us with a consensus draft that was very close to what the agency ultimately adopted. And what it did was it set notifications out at a quarter mile based on property lines, and then actual setbacks based on areas that that students use. So overall, staff and the commission and the various stakeholders were very pleased with the rules that came out of that. Flow line rulemaking, this was initiated in 2017 and completed in early 2018, and it overhauls the 1100 series. This does have Senate Bill 89-181 implications, because obviously flow lines carrying liquid product have a capacity to, if they don't have integrity, to impact groundwater. So this was a big deal. It was a pretty lengthy rulemaking process in late 2017. We overhauled the 1100 series, which covers flow lines. It provided new definitions for various types of flow lines, created new registrations, and adopted existing standards, more closely aligned us with agencies like PHMSA, the Pipeline Hazardous Safety Materials Administration, and PUC, the Public Utilities Commission here in Colorado. Requires more detail to be submitted and maintained on the design, installation, and operations and maintenance of flow lines. Requires operators to be tier 1 level, one call members. That's Colorado 811. So if the call before you dig, to prevent those line strikes that might be causing impacts. Requires significantly stepped up the integrity management program, and also revised the abandonment requirements. In order to implement all that, we did pull on some new engineering staff. Next, the Bradenhead test policy development. The Bradenhead is a term used to describe the annular space between the surface casing of an oil and gas well, which protects the groundwater aquifers, and the production casing, which goes all the way down to the producing formation. And the testing of the Bradenhead can really give us a lot of indications of the integrity of the well overall, and ensuring that the groundwater resources are protected. So this has been a pretty significant push for us to get a well-defined policy on the books. We've had a policy, but it needed to be strengthened and clarified. So it's required for all DJ Basin wells. So primarily it's targeted where the bulk of our activity is happening, where we have an interplay of older and newer wells. For new wells, testing is required after drilling and prior to stimulation. And then again, testing is required after stimulation. The reaction threshold is 50 PSI, which is lower than our former reaction threshold. And that just requires then some notifications to our staff, some additional tests, potential additional testing, depending on the circumstances. And then all those tests are documented on a new form we developed, the Form 17, which is then reviewed by our engineering department to look at the overall integrity of the well. And I believe not quite the last policy issue is the financial assurance work group. So this was in follow-up to an executive order issued by Governor Hickenlooper in July 2018. It was a working group made up of industry, local, state, and federal governments, environmental community, and private citizens. And the goal was to review the financial assurance requirements best practices that operators were using, look at other states' financial assurance requirements, and develop recommendations for updating Colorado's rules. We currently require, financial assurance for individual wells, but an operator who operates more than 20 wells can get a blanket bond for their wells statewide. And then, there's certain levels of bonding. There's other individual facility bonds, centralized waste management bonds, and gas plant and gas facility bonds. So just looking at all those and making sure that the coverage that the state needs is there. The group met 4 times over several months and ultimately developed a report to the governor on December 1st with a commitment to promulgate rules by September 2019. So we've got a tall order to then implement that report, and that report is available on our website. The recommendations basically included increasing bonding and clarifying definitions for inactive wells, develop a risk model for asset transfers so that we can analyze and make sure that risk is adequately covered by financial assurance, create a plug-in remediation and reclamation fund, and just consider increasing our basic bonding amounts. Proposition 112, although it did not pass, it was a focus this year of the regulated community. It proposed a 2,000-foot setback from residences and sensitive areas. Although it excluded federal lands, it would have removed significant resources from development. Obviously, you've, I'm sure, heard plenty about this and don't want me to talk much more about it. But the significance was in August through November, we had a significant permitting push from industry because of the uncertainty of whether or not Prop 112 would pass. We received probably double our average permit load in those months. So it did have an effect on our agency and our work units, our permitting work units. So now I'm going to talk briefly about our groundwater sampling requirements. You've heard some of this spiel before. As I mentioned earlier, we have about 53,000 active wells, and we've averaged 4,500 APDs submitted, applications for permit to drill submitted annually since 2011. I mentioned that significant permit push. In 2018, we had 9,500. On average, 2,500 wells each year have been spud again since 2011, and that number was 1,700 in 2018. And as I said before, most of this activity was in the Denver-Julesburg Basin. And let's see, yes, I do have a pointer. So that puts most of the activity right in this area in Weld County. So just a summary of our sampling requirements. Rule 609 is statewide sampling requirement for oil and gas wells, multi-well sites, and dedicated injection wells, and has been in place since 2013. Rule 609 requires the sample collection of up to 4 wells prior to the oil and gas well being spud. Post samples are required to be collected from the same water sources at 1 year and 5 years after well completion. So it gives us that baseline, and it gives us the follow-up samples after. That rule 609 applies outside, where's my pointer again? There we go. Outside of this yellow box that you can see behind the red oil and gas wells, which is the greater Wattenberg area, which is an area established in our rules. So all the other wells statewide, Rule 609 applies to. Within that square box where the bulk of the operations are, Rule 318A applies to those wells in that area. And those wells in that area, operators are required to sample one well within the nearest quarter section, or within the same or nearest quarter section. So it gets you a closer sample typically, and then they're also still required to get the pre and post. And because there's so much activity in that area, and because there's so many water wells in that area, we're getting a very high density of sample coverage as oil and gas operators continue to move forward. All the data that is submitted to the COGCC is reviewed by staff during the various verification process. And when I say staff, that's Arthur Kepsel back there. Goes through a ton of data on both a daily, monthly, and annual basis, and looking for any impacts to water wells. And primarily what we're looking for in this program is gas impacts, thermogenic methane impacts. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. And all of the data that's in our database are publicly available through various data downloads on our website. So that's been a huge push to get that out there, get the transparency up. So the COENV database is the database that manages all of this. And I'll have to, sorry about the small font on this one. We've got data going back to 1941 from various sources. This data was originally maintained in an Access database when we had our San Juan Basin and coal bed methane sample programs. It was an Access database. We rolled it into a SQL Server database a few years ago. And we've now got over 16,000 sample locations and 46,000 individual samples. And I believe it's over 1 million analyte results in our database right now. So operators can interface with this, and then it also feeds our GIS system. So you can click on our maps and find the data. This year, we completed the development of our e-form submittal for groundwater data. So operators are able to submit with the e-form their sample results, and they get back a receipt for that sample so that they can document compliance. And that's been very helpful for both internal, for the way we process the data, external, it makes it much more smooth. And then you can also find those forms in the well records. I mentioned this, 16,000 sample locations, 40,000 individual samples, and 1 million individual analyte results. The green triangles there represent sample locations. Obviously, if you zoom in on those things, you get all those results. Our GIS system is completely interactive, so people can click on those and pull down the well. They can select multiple, pull down multiple wells at once, and get those data. We also, if you overlay those with our well records and our and the data we get from the Division of Water Resources for the water well records, you can really get a good picture of a confined area. And our staff use all of those data in our investigations, water well investigations as well. Here's just an example of the, what the typical, you click on the triangle, here's the data from one well, one sampling event. There'll be multiple sampling events that you can pull down. If you'll notice right here, there's a button that says Export CSV, and you can also select all and export CSV, so you can very quickly just get, hey, I want all the data for this one well, and you can pull all that into a Excel file. And many people have taken the opportunity to do that. So there's numerous studies out there, both by our agency, by other agencies, by non-governmental organizations that have pulled those data down and looked for them. Looked for trends, data trends by area, by operator. They've done all kinds of good stuff with it. We still, I mentioned operator, we still have a pretty high, I would say, participation by operators in sort of voluntary sampling that goes beyond what our rules require. There are several operators out there who, if our rules require 4 wells to be sampled, they're looking at all the wells, within the vicinity and knocking on all those doors and sampling. We're getting all of that data in as well, so we get a pretty good coverage as the industry continues their development. I mentioned external studies, so that's just a summary of the various studies that are using our data. So a few internal projects that were of interest this year. I'm just going to go through 2 case studies of individual water well investigations, and then one sort of larger, more global picture that's moving forward. And then I'll certainly take questions. So case study number 1 was a initial discovery of dissolved methane in a domestic well in April of 2014. It was identified during an operator's 318A. It's in the greater Wattenberg area, so in their baseline sampling. It was confirmed to be thermogenic through follow-up sampling. 2 nearby, so that's in the well we're looking at is this one here. Oh, excuse me, it's this one here. 2 nearby wells were also found in our subsequent investigation to have thermogenic methane mixed with biogenic methane, and in a lesser proportion of thermogenic to biogenic. Our initial compositional analysis indicated that the likely source was these nearby Sussex producing wells. There were 4 of them here that were pretty close to the initial discovery well. And so COGCC issued, they were all operated by one operator. We issued a notice of alleged violation to that operator, requiring further investigation. Further forensic interpretation of the isotopic analyses indicated a good match actually to J-sand gas, not Sussex gas. And so armed with that data, and based on that isotopic data, other supporting lines of evidence, which included well logs, Laramie Fox Hills structure maps, and other engineering data, COGCC resolved that first NOAV to this operator, and actually issued a second NOAV to an operator of J-sand wells in close proximity and down dip. In 2018, we were able to resolve this case with an administrative order by consent, and it provided an alternative safe drinking water supply to these affected parties. Required the operator to plug the implicated, whoops, lost my pointer again, plug the implicated J-sand producing wells, and we fined the operator for a failure to maintain well integrity. So looking at how those lines of evidence and how we made those determinations, in our initial look at the data, these MWW, LWW, and WWW are the water well data, and then these solid lines are various gas production gas samples. And looking at the isotopic results for methane, we felt that we were looking at, it was close, the various data could have been any of those gas sources. So looking at the closest oil and gas wells sort of made the most sense. As we looked into the isotopic data of ethane and propane, what we found was a very good match for J-sand gas, and it didn't look anything like the Sussex or the Niobrara commingled gas of the other producing wells. So this compositional analysis and the stable isotope analysis really gave us the tools we needed to point a pretty clear finger at given wells. Looking at the engineering data, we did. We had the operator run pretty sophisticated noise logs of the wells, and we looked for gas movement behind the casing, and all of those things put together drew us to this conclusion. And during the plugging of those wells, it was, everything was really brought home and confirmed for us. So, 2014 to 2018, I think I've mentioned in past years that, this process isn't always easy and we don't always find what we're looking for. But staff worked really hard on this one to get to that resolution, and we're really pleased to get this case closed out. Second one was discovered this year, July 2018. In preparation for drilling and completing new horizontal wells, an operator sampled numerous wells in Section 20 in late 2017. And these are sort of these samples here that form an L shape. And this was, again, the operator was required to sample one well because it's in the greater Wattenberg area. They sampled about 20. And they found biogenic in some of those, but not all of them, biogenic gas. No oil and gas impacts implicated there. One property owner drilled a new well in early 2018 and then contacted the operator and said, hey, sample my well. Well, that new well, oops, hard time finding that, was this one here, and very close to an existing vertical oil and gas well. And lo and behold, the new well had thermogenic gas in it. So we contacted the operators with oil and gas wells in the area, required that they provide an alternative source of drinking water to the water well owner. We required an engineering review of the operating oil and gas wells, production gas samples, Braden head gas samples if they existed. And then we also required resampling of some of the previously sampled wells to make sure none of them had flipped from biogenic impacts or biogenic gas naturally occurring to thermogenic impacts. The nearest well here, that's the highlighted dot, was really the most likely source. I mean, very, very close proximity. Unfortunately, we didn't have the same isotopic, high confidence isotopic signature match to that well. So we were really unable in this case to point the finger at that well and say, yes, it's absolutely you. The operator tested the well, the integrity passed, although they had done repairs in the past. So it could have been older production gas or older gas from a isolated gas bearing zone higher up in the column that was moving around behind the casing. We didn't have that forensic data to go back and issue a violation in this case. However, recognizing the impacts, the operator of the old vertical well and the new horizontal wells struck an agreement to plug out that well and provide a permanent alternative source of drinking water to this impacted landowner. So in the end, no enforcement action has been taken, but the complaint has been resolved. And I'll show you here, where you saw those lines converging in the previous case. Whoops, still trying to find my dot. There it is. Where the lines converged in the previous case, they really diverge up here in the longer chain hydrocarbons in this case. So we just didn't have the same confidence that we had the gas source clearly identified. And again, that goes to the challenge of what we're doing, the forensics that we're doing. hundreds to thousands of feet below ground. So the last situation is a moving forward thing. And this is an operator that we've been working with. It's a large operator in the northern TJ Basin. They operate a large number of wells, and they had a large number of wells shut in for a variety of reasons. It was during horizontal development of the area, and so they shut in the wells while they're drilling other wells in close proximity. They also had a number of wells shut in or temporarily abandoned due to a consent decree issued by APCD, the Air Pollution Control Division. Our rules require a mechanical integrity test, an MIT, for shut-in or TA wells. And many of the operators' wells did not ultimately demonstrate integrity. Some of them they failed to test, some of them didn't pass an integrity test, and some of them did. So there was a spectrum here. Ultimately, COGCC evaluated 222 of their wells based on the MIT results, the Bradenhead test results, wellbore geometry, and the construction information, looking for a history of well repairs and other work downhole. We conducted an environmental review, looked for where they sat with respect to receptors, and ranked those 222 wells in some reasonable fashion to work through assessment of them. We resolved their compliance issues with an administrative order of consent, and in that AOC, we required a Form 27 for at least 31 of the wells. And so those investigations will include groundwater sampling, if there are existing domestic wells around or water sources around, may include installing monitoring wells to the Laramie Fox Hills, which in many cases may be 400 to 700 feet deep, in other cases shallower than that. But this is I'm highlighting this because it's going forward. The investigation is going forward, and it's an issue where the other policies of our agency and other units have really influenced and found an issue where we can go ahead and conduct investigations as to whether or not this operator, those compliance issues may have led to impacts to groundwater. At this point, we're in the wait and see because the investigations are just starting, but they're starting in Q1 of 2019. So that will be something that you can look forward to for a report on that next year. And that concludes my report, and I am happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Greg. Great report. Questions, Fred?
Thanks very much for that. Just curious, when you fingerprint gas or other hydrocarbons from a particular formation from isotopes or other perspectives, is it likely that fingerprint's going to be throughout the basin, or do you see variations in that formation around the basin? I mean, can you finger at something, or is there work required?
Sure. So I would say there are some typical, some things would look typical, but we always strive to get a production gas sample as close to the water well impact that we would be investigating, just because there is a certain amount of variability. So the closer we can get the production gas sample, the better we can either point our finger at it or not. And in the first case study, those samples did come directly from the implicated wells, and the confidence interval was like 95%. If we looked at J-sand gas from other areas of the basin, we probably wouldn't have had quite as high a confidence interval.
Other questions? Joan?
Hi there. Thanks for the presentation. Let's see where to begin. I don't have a long question, but I just have, I worked very closely with your agency in my former life. And I just want to say I appreciate how difficult your job is and how well you guys do it. Colorado and COGCC are leaders among the states in the country in just across the board. Particularly, I think the groundwater data relevant to this commission is incredibly helpful. Other states do not even require this kind of work, and you guys publish, as you said, sort of millions of data on this. So, and people do mine it and use it, and it's great. So congratulations on that. So my question just is about the new Bradenhead policy. And I think that's very cool. You guys moved forward on that. It was an issue a couple of years ago when I was still at EPA. Do you anticipate that being a tool that will allow you to be more proactive in the DJ Basin, to sort of, rather than sort of lagging, like, you're the one case study, a 4-year process of getting to resolution? Do you see the Bradenhead policy being a tool that allow you to be more proactive in sort of addressing issues before they actually impact groundwater?
Well, I mean, maybe the way to answer that is to find them earlier. I'm not sure. I mean, if you run the Bradenhead test and it is successful and there's no pressures on the Bradenhead, odds are the groundwater has not been impacted. That's what we want to see. Because we're requiring that test annually now, I think we will find those issues that may be already occurring, but they're latent. We're not seeing them. And so I think it's going to be more of a window opening that we're able to see those things, not necessarily getting ahead of them, other than as now, if you look at it 10 years from now, and we've done annual testing, and we find one that is tested with no issues for 10 years, we're finding at the very early stages of some integrity issue. So I guess yes and no.
You think it's going to up your game in terms of discovery of issues?
I do. I definitely think it will up our game in terms of discovery. And I guess I do. I should say, yes, it is a proactive measure because we're looking at those wells now every year.
Other questions? Kevin?
Thank you. I'm just curious, what is a typical alternative drinking water source, both temporarily, let's say during the investigation phase, and then you also mentioned permanent? Like, what is it?
Sure. So temporary often looks like a cistern with water deliveries. And so the operator will hook up to their to their plumbing that goes into the house and set a cistern. Usually, if it's temporary, it's probably above ground. If it's in the winter, they might set it down in the ground so it doesn't freeze. And then a water delivery company will come and fill that. Temporary goes on for 3 years. That can be a tiresome solution for a water well owner. Ultimately, our goal, because frequently biogenic methane exists in the same well that we're addressing a thermogenic methane issue. Our goal is to have a safe drinking water source. Since methane is toxicologically inert, it's not a health risk to the people, it's a safety risk. So if we can take that well water and mitigate the methane, remove the methane from it before it goes into their house, so that might be an external cistern with some cascading, cascading the water over some baffles and venting out the methane, or an aeration system that just puts bubbles in it and vents out the methane. And then the water goes into the house without the methane in it. In some cases, it's close enough to a public water system that they can tap into, rural Weld County water or something like that. We typically would dictate a safe drinking water supply and let the operator and the water well owner determine what that agreement looks like. We've been asked to require hookup to a municipal water system or a rural water system, and we have not been able to mandate that, because the operator can propose an alternative source that satisfies the safe drinking water need.
Yes, Patrick?
Thanks, Greg. I'm going to echo what Joan said. You know, given limited resources, you guys do a fantastic job, and always a pleasure working with you all. Most recently on reclaimed water for exploration and production purposes, and you know, all the other issues that we have to work on in the enforcement area and all the way around. You guys are great to work with. I had a couple of questions. One, the first one on the severance tax, I think it's 158 billion that you mentioned, which is record production. How will that impact severance tax receipts for the year, and the money that we use for some of our infrastructure programs, particularly for our small community and disadvantaged community grants, which obviously outside of your lane, and that question may be outside of your lane. I just didn't know if you knew. So how that will impact severance tax. And then the final thing, I think you kind of touched on it, but I'm not sure that I heard the detail that I was looking for on orphan wells, and whether you have a funding source for that, and what work you guys may have upcoming with respect to remediation of orphan wells.
Great, thanks. And
I think you have a phone a friend coming up.
Likewise to you on our working relationship, and I am glad to have Mike Leonard joining for certainly the first question, and he may as well take both of these.
Thank you. Apologize for not coming up earlier. I've been working on another issue.
No worries. Let him go as long as he can.
No,
and
he does a great job.
Support.
Severance tax is going to really depend on price of oil. So even though production is up, price of oil has started to fall again. So I think it'll balance out. We'll just have to see how that works out.
Because I know in like the past couple of years, we've seen a dip in terms of severance tax receipts and the amount of money that we would otherwise have gotten in.
And part of that was because of the refund that was refunded.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
So we're hoping that's all cleaned up and leveling out. And your second question on orphan wells, we have a $5 million fund that legislature gave us to start the orphan well program. So, and I'm sorry, I didn't hear your second part of that question.
Well, just related to that, is there going to be any kind of fee or any type of revenue source associated with current activities that may go towards that, or where are you looking at getting some money to be able to rectify it? Because I know there's a ton of those orphan wells, and you obviously don't have we don't have the manpower to be able to go out and attack those. But is there a steady source of funding that may come in to help address those?
That would be part of the financial assurance program that Greg talked about earlier. So.
Okay.
So I guess a couple things, and I touched on this in our written report. I didn't really mention it in this presentation. As Mike mentioned, that $5 million number is new to us.
You got another phone a friend coming too.
Excellent.
Alex is rolling in.
So the $5 million was given to, I can't say given.
No, it was
allocated.
Was allocated to us, thank you, from the legislature this year to be spent over a 2-year period on plugging and abandoning orphaned wells. And that's up from our previous 435,000 that we had. So that's a significant increase. We have, with that, staffed up a new program that is approaching projects either as just straight engineering, plugging projects, equipment inventory issues, environmental issues, and reclamation issues. Some of the projects obviously touch on all 4 of those aspects. So this year, the primary push of that program has been to, characterize the known or inventory of orphan sites, prioritize them based on some semblance of risk, and then start basically the procurement process of getting the right contractors in place. This upcoming fiscal year, or the fiscal year that we're in now, we expect to really move forward with a lot of those projects. And I think we've initiated around 20 such projects, and our inventory is, I think, closer to a few hundred.
There's 260 orphan wells, 350 orphaned locations. Some of the locations, the wells have already been plugged, but the reclamation needs to be done.
And I'm assuming those are knowns, right? Are there
those are the
unknowns
ones that we
need
have
to investigate?
identified currently. Yes.
And would this effort include investigation of new orphan wells? I don't know.
Well,
I don't know if there is such a thing.
So
or
we
you guys
are
know where they're all
the
at.
inventory of orphaned wells has the potential to grow if through an enforcement action or a bankruptcy proceeding, an operator is no longer an operator, and those wells do become sort of our custody as an orphaned well. Then the inventory grows. We had, I think, a dozen or so cases in this last year of bond claim. We would call them a bond claim. So we collect the operator's financial assurance, which oftentimes isn't enough to cover the liabilities. Did you want to add anything as a phone a friend?
Well, I guess what I would add is that the financial assurance working group and the rulemaking that's going to happen under the 700 rules, that increase in financial assurance hopefully will help before the operators kind of fall off the cliff.
When is that, Alex?
I think rulemaking has to be completed by September.
Great.
Yeah.
We also just released part of the governor's executive order asked that industry help plug wells. So we just released an option for industry to where they can plug wells and get credit on their mill levy if the operator plugs it, or they can get direct payment.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? I would say that the state's come a long way making data available to the public, especially with GIS ties that people can go in and look at where your 40,000 wellheads have been sampled and see what's available. But I would encourage the agencies to continue to find ways to work together so that if you post a report on the quality of water in a specific well and the state engineer's office is looking in that area, it automatically links to those so that all of this good data is integrated together.
Maybe topic number one for this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Greg commented that he thought that this format of having the implementing agencies report together is a good one. I think that's because he thinks it would take some of the pressure off of him. But if division staff or other implementing agencies have comments, we'd be glad to take them at this time. Or if you don't want to say them in public, you can talk to Tricia. But this has been an interesting experiment, so we'd like to get your input.
I'll just say from my perspective, Rick, I like it. I like the interaction that all of the agencies have. I think we've all learned some new things today, and certainly the conference this afternoon will be a furtherance of that. So I very much appreciate all of the presentations and the folks coming forward this morning.
Anybody else have comments? Okay, we'll take about a 10 or 15-minute break to have some lunch, and then we'll start our administrative.
May I make a request or a question? I guess ask a question is, in light of maybe some time constraints, would you be amenable to grabbing lunch and starting eating while we begin the presentations? Yeah, like more like a 5-minute.
We'll just take 5 minutes and then we'll beg that you excuse us for eating while you're talking to us.
Thank you.
Yes, I was just. Yeah, yes, definitely. We have 2 Barbara Mays. Oh, yes. Although it's sort of retired. Jerry knows what he's talking about. Yes, please.
Remind me if I don't think.
Sure, sure.
College?
Yeah.
Boulder. Yeah.
Wish I'd gotten that. Whatever Fred's having.
Salmon, that's what I got.
What's yours, Rick?
That's the avocado pear stuffed with something yummy. So when you went to Mexico, were you able to take family or just?
My husband and I went. My daughter
Nice.
declined to go.
Oh, really? She doesn't know what she was missing.
She regrets not going.
Now that she's seen all the postings.
Well, and I got home. She said, Mom, she's 15. I was so homesick. She started to cry. It's like, no, wait a minute.
You were home.
I guess, yeah.
So she stayed with friends?
Home for her. Her big sister, her other daughter, came up from LA.
Oh, nice. Nice. They probably had a lot more fun than they let on.
I don't know.
How old is the big sister?
She's 28.
Oh.
And she's the middle daughter.
Uh-huh.
And she's kind of been mean to Lauren.
It's easy to be mean to the youngest.
Exactly.
They always get away with so much.
But Lauren's kind of coming to her own, and I think she's like, stop it. Don't do that. So I think there was a little conflict, but I think it was healthy.
Good. Productive, if not.
Exactly. Exactly.
Hesitant to leave. When does it come back? They have a place close to
It's nice to have Romaine back in our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah. My mother almost died about 10 years ago. Yeah. And then she's recovered.
So I haven't been in Mexico City for 30-something years now. But what I was very surprised about when I was staying there was that there aren't just barrios that are, 8 square blocks or 20 square blocks, but you could walk from a hotel 1 block away and there was a whole bunch of shacks, down the next street. And so the neighborhoods were very mixed and very local.
Mm-hmm.
Is it still that way?
I think so. I don't have anything to compare it to because it's the first time I've been there. We didn't see any shacks or barrios, I would say. We were in pretty posh areas, but it is like that. It's like, and it's really the only way such a huge, small place could kind of function is in these sort of little cities within a city almost.
Yep.
These neighborhoods kind of become a distinct sort of jurisdiction or something.
Who are these people?
So it's still very much like that. It is such
Thank
a
you,
sprawling
I guess.
Thank you. Sir? Yep.
When we were there, a few of us decided to go out and see a bullfight and just see what it was like. And we found that the easiest way to get there was to take the metro, which is above ground in most of the area. So it was fascinating to do a 20-minute metro ride across the city and see how different it is.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that. We drove to Oakland. There was a little bit of driving, but flying in, it was actually a clear day.
Which is
really
unusual.
I know. We really got that sense of just how big and sprawling and diverse the city is.
Yep.
It's nice that you're in a position where you have some flexibility to be able to have everybody.
We have everybody. So if you'll excuse us for munching while you talk, we will reconvene. We have an administrative action hearing to consider. We have an administrative action hearing to consider revisions to the interim guidance for implementation of discharger-specific variance provisions, Commission Policy 13-1. I understand we have a report from the division. Thank you very much. And then we have 4 parties that have asked to address the commission, so we'll hear those after the division presentation.
You want to list who those are so that they know, and then if there's anyone else who has.
What I have in my notes is that we will hear the South Platte Water Renewal Partners for up to 5 minutes, the City of Pueblo for 5 minutes, Metro Wastewater up to 7 minutes, and Parker and Dominion Water and Sand District up to 7 minutes. Anybody else? We'll check the sign-in sheet to see if anybody else wants to address the commission as we get near the end of those groups. Hi, Barbara. Hi, Blake.
Hello.
Welcome. Would you like to tell us who you are and swear to tell the truth, please?
Sure. I'm Barbara Bennett with the Standards Unit, and I swear to tell the truth.
Blake B.A. with the Standards Unit. I also swear to tell the truth.
Great. So we're here today to tell you about the division's proposed revisions to Policy 13-1, the Commission's guidance for development, adoption, and review of discharger-specific variances. So there are several purposes for the division's proposed revisions. The first is to record the Commission's policy decisions for the 6 DSVs that have been adopted since Policy 13-1 was first adopted. The second is to provide information on the new federal rule for water quality standards variances. And then the third goal was to provide more practical step-by-step guidance for each phase of developing a DSV proposal. The original version of Policy 13-1 placed a lot of emphasis on definitions and provided some conceptual guidance around how to do an alternatives analysis. But at the time it was written, we didn't have any experience in Colorado with variances. Now that the Commission has adopted 6 discharger-specific variances, we have some great case studies, and we have a lot of experience working with stakeholders in EPA. And we were able to use that to make this guidance document more useful and to really just provide more tangible step-by-step, here's what to do when you get to each phase in the process. These revisions represent the work of many, many people. Brett Eisenagel in particular, the engineering section manager, he's out of town and not available to be here today, but he contributed significantly in the revisions to this document, particularly around the guidance for the alternatives analysis process in Section 8. We had great insight and really, really good suggestions from stakeholders that had been through one of these 6 previous DSV hearings. We're really grateful for the time and effort that many people invested. We had attorneys and consultants from the City of Pueblo and the City of Los Animas and Suncor provided great suggestions into these revisions. EPA and CPW also provided some really great insight into this policy document from the perspective of reviewing these 6 DSVs that have come before the Commission so far. We also had a lot of help from staff in standards and permits and enforcement and management and many division staff reviewing changes as we were going and providing feedback, often on short notice, which I'm very grateful for, so that we could provide you coordinated recommendations and responses to comments. So with that, just a very sort of a quick background on the timing of events. Colorado's DSV rule became effective in 2013. That's also when the original version of Policy 13-1 was adopted. Then in 2015, EPA adopted the federal rule for variances. And since 2013, Colorado has adopted 6 DSVs, 2 ammonia DSVs for small public utilities, 3 selenium DSVs for public utilities, and 1 selenium DSV for an industrial facility. So just this will be my briefest attempt of an overview of DSVs, just for anyone in the room who needs a quick reminder on what are we talking about right now. DSVs are a temporary standards action. This requires both commission approval and EPA approval. And the underlying standard is still maintained as the long-term goal for the water body. DSVs are a last resort. These are used after other regulatory tools have been shown to be not the right tool. DSVs require a discharger to achieve the best feasible in-stream water quality during the term of the variance. And DSVs are justified by an alternatives analysis where the discharger explores, every potential alternative for complying with the WQ belt and then evaluates whether those alternatives are feasible. So for variances specifically, the commission has 3 very specific tests for feasibility. And those are the limits of technology, the economics test, and the other consequences test. So the benefit of a discharger-specific variance is when they're used is that it allows the discharger to maintain compliance while making progress over time towards attaining the underlying standard when it's not immediately feasible to do so. So one way to think about it is that DSVs are not really an exemption or an off-ramp. It is more of a slow lane while so that a facility can continue to make progress at a pace that is feasible as it becomes feasible over time. But the underlying goal remains the same. So my plan for today is to very briefly walk through the division's proposed revisions section by section. And you are welcome to ask your questions at any time as I go. My plan is to be very brief. So unless you have questions, I'm not going to get into the weeds on any particular topic. So the division's revisions include some significant reorganization of the document. This was one of the topics where we had really great feedback from stakeholders who'd been through the DSV process before about, what is the most logical order to present all this information and from the perspective of someone who's new to it. We have, several new appendices that we'll talk about. Section 2, we just added a little summary of the changes to Regulation 31 in 2016 regarding the DSV rule. In Section 3, the process for proposing a DSV, the division is proposing to add more details on what is needed at each phase in the process, as well as more context on just what to expect as you're working with the division through a DSV proposal. This was one of the sections where we received comments through public comments, and we made some additional revisions. We thought that was a really good suggestion to just provide more context here. Section 4 is central concepts and variances. We added some minor additional language to capture concepts from the federal rule. In Section 5, the feasibility tests, the division is proposing to move most of the details on the methods for using these feasibility tests to separate appendices. There is so much to say about the method for economic feasibility that it really deserves its own, section in the report, and same for environmental feasibility. Section 6 is the section on when a DSV is the appropriate regulatory tool. So this is one of the sections that the division proposes some significant reorganization to and some reframing of the language. The original version of policy 13-1 laid out a pretty linear process for getting to a DSV that was sort of framed as, well, first try to do a compliance schedule. And if that doesn't work, try to do a temp mon. And if that doesn't work, try the next thing. And what we found through experience is that there's not any one order that's necessarily the right order to look at these tools in. We thought it would be more helpful to reframe this section as matching regulatory tools to the problems that they were designed to address. And so the revised version of the guidance provides a lot more context and info and recent examples that are meant to help the reader sort of figure out which of these regulatory tools is best suited to their particular site-specific circumstances. Section 7, useful data for beginning the DSV process and quantifying the baseline condition. This is a new section. Several people thought it would be helpful to just have a dedicated section to lay out what data do you need when you're getting started. Thought that was a great idea. Section 8 is the alternatives analysis framework. So it's still conceptually the same process that was laid out in the original guidance, although the new version includes a much more detailed step-by-step guidance for developing the alternatives analysis and identifying the selected alternative. I think that the revisions better address the two purposes of the alternatives analysis, which are to demonstrate that there are no feasible alternatives for meeting the WQBL, but then also to identify the feasible alternatives that would result in the highest degree of protection of classified uses. The original version of the guidance document really spoke to the first purpose of demonstrating there are no feasible alternatives for meeting the WQBL. And these revisions are meant to provide really more guidance on addressing both of these purposes in the alternatives analysis. So the steps included in the guidance are meant to provide a recommended path that should be the most efficient and the most cost-effective for most cases. Certainly, permittees are free to approach this, in a different order if they have unique circumstances and it makes sense to do that. This is certainly, not meant to be binding. But in our experience, this is what we think is going to be the most useful order to approach things in so that we can efficiently, answer those two questions that the alternatives analysis is meant to answer. And I won't go through all of these, but just as an example, step 1 is to identify the source and fate of the pollutant. I have seen, several stakeholders begin an alternatives analysis and dive right into evaluating different treatment options that could be added on to the end of treatment. And often, sometimes the most cost-effective and, affordable and just effective solution can be source control or, really understanding where the pollutant is coming from can really help, narrow the effort of the alternatives analysis on those sources. So doing this step first in the end can save a lot of time and money. So the next section, section 9, development of alternative effluent limits. There's quite a bit of recommended revisions to this section to provide just some context from the commission decisions on the 6 DSVs already. I think we've all learned a lot through the commission process and through working with EPA and seeing sort of, what revisions led to successful outcomes for the city of Los Animas and Pueblo and the town of Nucla and Suncor. So we've included several recommended new subsections here to discuss protecting ambient in-stream quality during the term of the variance and meeting the needs of the federal rule, a new subsection on numeric AELs and some guidance around that, some guidance on narrative AELs and, including the commission's preference for only using this when necessary. So, and we have some useful examples and lessons learned that I think future DSV proponents will find helpful. Section 10 is implementation and permits. The division recommends keeping this section pretty general and really just sort of highlighting, overall the categories of things that are implemented in permits without including any sort of permitting policy decisions in policy 13-1, since 13-1 is the commission's document. We're also recommending a new section, section 11, to really explain the different roles for the commission and the division as it relates to variances. So this, you've seen this slide before and I won't go through all of these, but this is we are recommending that the guidance includes this information to help readers understand which parts of the variance are part of the commission's decision during rulemaking, and then which details are worked out through the permitting process. And so we did receive several requests through public comment for a division permitting policy on DSV implementation. Division management looked at this in the context of all the other things that the permit section is working on right now, and it won't be feasible to do it in this fiscal year, but it's definitely something that the division can look at in the next fiscal year. And in the meantime, for all 6 DSV proponents that have had a proposal before the commission, we have coordinated extensively between standards and permits ahead of the hearing, so that all of the DSV proponents knew before they went into the hearing how the DSV was going to be implemented in the permit and what to expect. And we will absolutely continue to do that. It is very important to understand permits implementation ahead of the hearing, so that we know if there's something about the AEL or the proposal that that we need to think about before the commission adopts it, so that everything can be implemented as enforceable requirements in the permit. Section 12, periodic review requirements and expiration date. This section was updated to include some information from the new federal rule, and then also just some more context regarding what the commission expects from parties during triennial review. Section 13 describes the relationship of DSVs and impaired waters. This section was also updated per the federal rule. Section 14 is just a short section on other types of variances. There are variances in Regulation 85 and in other regulatory contexts that are very different than the water quality standards variances we're talking about. And so this little section is just to help readers know if they're looking at the right document, or if they're interested in another variance, it points them, where do you need to go to find the other info. And then, so the appendices, there's several new appendices that we're recommending be included in 13-1. Appendix A includes just a list of resources, other, EPA and other resources that people might find helpful for developing variance proposals. Appendix B is a crosswalk of terms in Colorado and the federal rule. There are a number of terms that are similar but not exactly the same between the state and federal language, and so this little translator table, I think, can kind of help people match up the requirements. Appendix C relates the Colorado and federal downgrading factors. These are really important, as this is the basis for the feasibility tests. And so this context can be helpful in a way in using the feasibility tests, but it's we thought that being in its own appendix would be more useful than trying to have this information within the discussion of the feasibility tests itself. Appendix D is an updated checklist, completeness review checklist. Appendix E is the methods for economic feasibility. This is another area where we were able to provide just more practical step-by-step guidance and examples based on the experience of previous DSV proponents. And then finally, Appendix F is the methods for environmental feasibility. There's no new content in this. The commission has not yet adopted a variance where environmental feasibility was a significant part of the decision, so we don't really have any new information or lessons learned to record on this topic yet. So one of the questions that was raised in public comment was around the timing for developing a DSV proposal. And if it takes a year or two to complete a proposal for a discharger-specific variance, when do you do that? And should dischargers request a temporary modification or extended compliance schedule? How do you build in time to do that? So and I think the broad answer is it will depend on site-specific circumstances and the complexity of the situation and kind of where they're at in the cycle already. But in most cases, I would recommend doing what NUCLA did. I'm going to walk you through this sort of path for timing for how the town of NUCLA did their DSV proposal. I think that this will work for most stakeholders. The town of NUCLA, got a new permit with new ammonia limits, WQBLs, under a sort of a typical compliance schedule. And they started the process just like you would start with a plan toward compliance, retaining an engineer, identifying pollutant sources. They did an alternatives analysis to support their funding request and then evaluated their funding options with grants and loans, figured out how much, grant funding they might be able to qualify for. And that's at that point is when it became very clear that there weren't going to be any economically feasible options for complying with their ammonia WQBLs. So at that point, they requested a discharger-specific variance. Once that was approved, then the permit can be modified. The AELs are used in place of the WQBLs, and then they move on in the process for designing pollution control and then building and optimizing pollution control. So, their process was they were one of the first ones to come up. I think now that we have some experience around how this works, a simple scenario like that should only take about a year. Another thought is that once you've done these first couple steps of identifying pollutant sources and evaluating alternatives, if it turns out that there is a really difficult, compliance situation, a facility is in a better position at that point to ask for an extension to a compliance schedule because they've made a good faith effort to try to make progress towards compliance. It might be easier to do it at that point than to, ask straight out the gate. So further, part of the effort of the 10-year roadmap is to talk about feasibility, look at feasibility, give folks a lot of advance notice on what the criteria are going to be before they're adopted so that facilities have time to evaluate feasibility and think about variances before new limits are ever included in their permit. The hope is to get to the point where we don't need to use temp mods so often to provide time to work on DSVs. So we are at a place right now where we still have some catching up to do with using this tool. There are certainly more facilities out there that have compliance situations now that would certainly qualify for a DSV, and it's going to take us a couple more years to just catch up on those. There are even some facilities in enforcement now that the DSV tool, the rule didn't exist. It wasn't an option when their limits were first included in their permit, and now they're under enforcement. So in those cases, it will be possible for the discharger who's under enforcement to make participation in a DSV hearing part of the actions that they're going to do to make progress back towards compliance. But our hope is to, catch up on those situations and then, hopefully with outreach and sharing information and thinking about feasibility ahead of time, get to a point where everyone has time to work on this before, limits are implemented in the permit. Also, we had a number of comments around and concerns around the cost for developing DSV proposals. So, and I have kind of a number of sort of thoughts and ideas to share on this. From the division's experience, we've paid for several feasibility studies that various contractors have done for us. And in our experience, we've had several feasibility studies for $25,000. The Selenium AECOM report was $25,000. Our ammonia fact sheet feasibility studies. And then at the upper end of that, My best estimate on the temperature feasibility study is that that was probably closer to $250,000 if you include all of the staff time that the engineering section spent on that. So that is an example of, you know, an unconventional pollutant of an extremely complicated feasibility study that also includes a lot of information on energy neutrality and sustainability and other goals. So I think that, you know, the vast majority of DSVs should fall somewhere between those two extremes, at least for the, you know, the engineering analysis associated with it. The lower range of the costs should be expected for conventional pollutants. You know, and higher costs are to be expected where you have unconventional pollutants or multiple pollutants. I would like to note that facilities who qualify for SRF loans can often get a design and engineering grant, and they can use that grant money to pay for the work on the alternatives analysis that's used in a discharger-specific variances. So there is some help for small communities in helping with this cost. The big variable in cost is to what extent is additional data collection needed, to what extent are you know, pilot studies or bench tests needed to figure out what is the best feasible alternative. You know, in selenium is a really good example. This photograph is, you know, thanks to Suncor for this photograph from their pilot study of the dissolved air flotation device. I think Suncor probably spent $1 million over the course of a decade on pilot studies for selenium. They never told us, but I wouldn't be surprised at all. They did, you know, 20 pilot studies on selenium. Selenium is a tricky pollutant. How it behaves in treatment can really depend a lot on site-specific factors, and sometimes, you know, the only way to resolve the uncertainty between a few really, you know, promising options might be to, you know, do some studies and investigate those. So I have 2 recommendations for minimizing the cost associated with DSV proposals, particularly when it comes to challenging pollutants like selenium. My first recommendation is to follow the revised guidance very, very closely. Those steps are designed to have the alternatives analysis start with a very screening level analysis of the broad range of alternatives and effectively winnow it down to those few alternatives that are the most, you know, have the most potential to be useful, so that the facility is, to the extent that they need to do pilot studies, they're investing in those strategies that are going to be the most likely to be beneficial and really be useful for making water quality progress and getting them on a long-term path to compliance. My second recommendation is to be engaged in the water quality forum. We have a discussion at almost every water quality forum meeting on some topic related to feasibility and variances. And we have, you know, folks coming and sharing their success stories, sharing their data and their case studies. And, you know, one of the ways that the cost can come down for a lot of stakeholders is if we can share data and share lessons learned and hopefully take advantage of the gains that, you know, other folks in the community with similar problems are facing. So, and then just as kind of a follow-on to that, there's, you know, certainly a number of challenges where I think we'll be using variances to address in the future. For the purpose of this guidance document, we were very careful to only include recommendations that were based on previous commission policy decisions. So to the extent that stakeholders would like to engage with the division on other issues or issues that have not yet come before the commission, a good place to do that would be through the Water Quality Forum as we explore these other topics, or just anyone is free to call me or email me. Most people already know that anyways. I'm always happy to engage on the question of, you know, new issues that haven't come up yet. And with that, I'll take any questions you have.
Thank you, Barbara. Questions? Yes.
Thank you. That was very clear and concise. So one of my questions has to do with the economics test and the substantial and widespread impact. To meet that test, is it truly an and that you have? So in the context of a lot of the experience that's happened so far, it's been public wastewater treatment plants where the widespread impact affects the community. But if you say you have a small industry, you could have a substantial impact that could, feasibly or potentially put an industry out of business, but widespread may or may not go with that. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
I'm more than happy to give you my ideas on that. Just realize this hasn't ever come up yet in a commission hearing, so we don't have any experience yet on this topic. What I do know from working through variances so far is that, yes, the EPA does expect a discussion of both how the impacts would be substantial and widespread. So far, typically, the widespread analysis has been a pretty qualitative description or a qualitative exercise of just sort of tying it back to, like, realistically, what would happen if this, town, if the variance wasn't approved, like, realistically, what would happen and how would that impact the community if the plant had to decommission and they all had to go on septic? Or in the case, Suncor was an example of a private industrial chiller. That's a very large one. So that was, kind of a different scenario than the scenario you're asking for. In terms of the scale, what I've heard from EPA is that what they consider the scale for thinking about when impacts are widespread usually relates to the impact of the water quality impact. So if you're looking at an impact that's very localized water quality impact, then they don't necessarily expect the economic analysis to be broader than the town or the facility or the area where that water quality impact is occurring. So I think the door is open to focus on what would be the impact to the community, to the people who work in that small industry, to the other maybe industries that rely on the products that small industry produces in that area. Would they have to pay more to get materials from somewhere else? I think you could. My recommendation is just to make it as real as possible. Like, realistically, what would be all of the consequences of this DSV not being approved? And how would that affect people?
Other questions? Go ahead.
Another question?
Yes.
But it's on a different topic. A couple of slides back, you had the timing of the DSV up there. And, one of the boxes was actually, select and design pollution control. And to me, one of the tricky things with DSVs is the temporary nature of the DSV and the fact that, say, small communities, wastewater treatment plants are selecting and designing pollution controls that would be expected to function for long periods of time. So that's the context of my question. My question is the review requirement, which I know is required by EPA, like the underlying drivers there. But my question is, do you have a sense of the level of detail or level of that level of information that would need to be provided as part of that 5-year review process?
That's a really good question. That question was also raised in public comment, and I'll read you the sentence that I attempted to get at that question with, and you can let me know if you think more is needed here. So the discharger is responsible for updating the alternatives analysis for each review in the context of the triennial review and identifying whether additional progress toward meeting the WQ bill is feasible. So this is the new sentence. The discharger may utilize the alternatives analysis that was included in the original DSV request and update the results where new data, new economic conditions, or new technology have become available since the DSV was adopted. The goal is not to have everyone reinvent the wheel every 5 years. The goal is just to see what have we learned in these last 5 years, how effective were the remedies that they've been trying to implement so far, and then what's changed. Are there new economic conditions? Has something fundamentally changed? If the town has twice as many people, then yeah, we do need to go back and redo the economic analysis, because that economic feasibility conclusion could be different. But if not, it should be as simple as saying that, these 5 things are all the same as they were. Here's one new thing. We'll update the alternatives analysis to reflect that.
Other questions? I believe it was one of the stakeholders raised the issue of whether the name interim still should apply to this. This has been a huge undertaking and rewrite, and I think it's very well done. I wonder if it's time to just drop the interim out of the name.
We've recommended that in our proposed revisions, yes.
Thank you. Other questions? Thank you for your good work.
Sure.
We'll hear from South Platte Water Renewal Partners. You have up to 5 minutes.
Oh, I forgot. Sorry. One more thing. We passed around a handout with some very minor final recommended edits to the policy. The first 2 were in response to trying to address some concerns raised by South Platte Water Renewal Partners and Metro Wastewater. Based on some conversations we had after the January 2nd revisions we submitted. So these are just some minor clarifying additional language that we think would help folks that might also get stuck on these points in the future. And then items 3 through 6 are just typo corrections. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have about these, or we can wait until the end to talk about cleanup if you want.
Thank you, Barbara. South Platte.
Mr. Chairman, while we're waiting for go ahead, come on up, guys. While we're waiting for the South Platte Water Renewal Partners to come to the table, I thought we should recognize that you just never know what's going to happen during a government shutdown. All sorts of people can wander into the background.
Introduce yourselves and swear to tell the truth.
Hi, Dan DeLauder. I'm the Data and Regulatory Programs Manager at South Platte Water Renewal Partners, and I swear to tell the truth.
Matt Montgomery from Hill and Robbins, and I swear to tell the truth as well.
Thank you. The South Platte Water Renewal Partners is a 50 MGD wastewater treatment plant serving approximately 300,000 residents in the South Denver metro area. For those of you that don't know, I don't know how long I'll keep saying this, but formerly Littleton Englewood Wastewater, owned by Littleton Englewood. And the mission of our facility is to sustainably protect and recover our community's vital resources. We do foresee the need to at least consider discharger-specific variances in the future, particularly for nutrients and temperature. Those are the ones on the radar right now anyway. We did provide written comments on the division's proposed DSV policy, and we do appreciate the division having reached out in the interim between the comments and this hearing, and we feel that most of our comments have been addressed. We do have a few remaining comments that I'll go through now. First up was concerns regarding the removal of temporary modification language. So the original version did have some substantial deletions of temporary modification language, and the division has reincorporated a substantial amount of that language. It's important, I think, to note that there's no policy on temporary modifications right now, and there is on DSVs and compliance schedules. So we felt that that language really was useful to clarify, you know, when each tool is appropriate. And I think the changes are helpful in that regard. And there are important distinctions between compliance schedules and temp mods in that when a temporary modification is in place, you know, really the effort is to resolve the underlying uncertainty. Whereas when there's a compliance schedule in place, the target is meeting those final effluent limits. So with this in mind, we do appreciate the division's clarification that I think it's page 10 of the policy that DSVs may be appropriate where there's more of an incremental approach to meeting the final limits, and temp mods may still have their place when there's that uncertainty, because none of us want to be spending public dollars to, you know, on a substantial capital project where the standards themselves are still uncertain. Next was concerns. Oh, I'm sorry. We did have one suggestion to revise the guidance, and that's Matt passed around an exhibit. Just some basic changes. The compliance versus DSV section, compliance schedule versus DSV section had a discussion of when a DSV may be more appropriate. And it seemed to us to be presented as kind of an either or option. And we just wanted to clarify that temp mods and site specific standards would still be on the table. These scenarios are just when a DSV would be more appropriate than a compliance schedule. Second was some concerns that we had identified related to requirements of the alternative effluent limits. And primarily we were asking that the language be aligned more with the federal regulation. And most of those changes were also made. One kind of outstanding question for us in the division's revised policy, there's some discussion about a baseline now that should be maintained. And I think in general, that concept makes sense. It gets at both the concentration and the flow of a facility, that you're protecting that in-stream water quality condition. We just wanted to point out that, you know, DSVs are complicated, and you may be talking about flow augmentation or changing a discharge location. All different scenarios are kind of on the table. So as we get into those considerations, we just ask that, you know, if it gets to the point where we need a work group process or something, that be considered. I think especially with temperature, you know, you could be talking about habitat and refuge and things that may not be direct numeric standards, but something that you're trying to compare apples to oranges. So, and then finally, we had a suggestion that some clarification be added to the policy on anti-degradation alternatives analysis. I know that alternatives analysis is used in multiple contexts in the state. I think with the anti-deg limits and DSVs, those are two situations where they're both used in the context of permit limits. I'm almost done. And so we just asked that a note be added to clarify that if you're looking for alternatives analysis for anti-degradation, to refer to the anti-deg policy. And I think the division had that in a footnote. We had some slightly different language here in front of you. That's all I had.
Thank you. Questions for South Platte Water Renewal Partners? Sure.
Do you have page numbers for these? Because I'm not finding it readily.
On the red lines?
Yes, on your red line.
I added the section numbers. I did not put page numbers.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I don't know if it's lining up, but maybe Barbara, you can help us navigate that when you come back. So we can, just for context, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Housekeeping questions. One, can you please email Amy the exhibit that you handed out? And then this is partly for you and partly for the division. So on the language about anti-degradation, you had it, Barbara, as a footnote to what's a proposed footnote. So were you just including, your footnote on your exhibit was just for context for today and not intended to be part of the policy? Is that right? I'm just wondering how different your two.
All of the changes on these are proposed changes to be included in the policy. Our proposed changes, Dan would not have seen these yet. It seeks to address the same thing.
Okay.
That his second recommendation is trying to address.
Okay, got it. Thank you. I got it.
Thanks. Anything else? Thank you. Next, we have the City of Pueblo with up to 5 minutes.
I'm starting to get nervous.
There's something going on.
Yeah, it's a coup.
Or a party.
Or a party, yeah.
Sorry, I just thought it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Deja vu all over again.
Gabe Rax with Radish and Reich for the City of Pueblo.
Andrea Ahrens, City of Pueblo.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Prior to this administrative action hearing, the division reached out to Pueblo and other proponents of previously adopted DSVs to solicit comments and feedback from Pueblo on experience in proposing a DSV and in using the policy 13-1. Pueblo appreciates the division's willingness to work with us and for being receptive to comments throughout the discussions. After that process, Pueblo also submitted written comments to the Commission on the division's initial proposed revisions to the policy. Pueblo has reviewed the division's revised proposal and believes that Pueblo's comments have been addressed. And we appreciate the division for modifying the initial version to incorporate suggested revisions. And we think that the proposed revisions to policy 13-1 do improve the policy and make it more useful for future proponents. Pueblo does want to comment on experience in proposing a DSV last summer. As many of you know, Pueblo spent a good deal of time and a lot of money preparing its DSV proposal so that it could be supported by the division and EPA and ultimately adopted by the Commission in last year's Arkansas Basin rulemaking hearing. In addition, Pueblo has a continuing interest in potential future compliance issues, as with many other facilities looking at temperature and nutrients in particular. And so we hope that the revisions to the policy will help those in pursuing DSV's proposals in the future to make the process more efficient and less costly, including the process for future review of existing DSVs. Communities with limited resources are hard-pressed to develop information to support a DSV, and scarce funds should be focused on water quality improvement measures to the extent possible. We appreciate the division's description of available resources and suggestions for ways to reduce costs, as well as actually working on feasibility studies to try to provide information that could be used by proponents. And we also look forward to ways to apply experience to continue to improve the process and make it more efficient. In particular, an overly costly and complex process could have unintended consequences for parties contemplating variances based on environmental impacts. This could discourage parties from moving forward with DSVs based on environmental impacts, and instead may have the unintended consequence of promoting discharges to choose alternatives that are less environmentally sustainable, which would have unfortunate effects on the environment. Therefore, we think that the Commission should carefully consider striking the appropriate balance between careful and thorough review of variance proposals and the complexity and expense of the process. Finally, as mentioned in our comments, an additional aspect that would be helpful for proponents is for the division to develop a guidance document about the implementation of DSVs and permits. This would help proponents to navigate the process even more successfully and provide guidance also internally that would be useful. Therefore, Pueblo asks the Commission to request that the division develop a permitting policy to explain the expectations for implementation of DSVs and permits. And so that's our kind of the last point that we'd like to make. We thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony in this rulemaking. We'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions for the City of Pueblo?
I guess a quick question. Just, for the record, you heard Barbara say that the division can't do a permitting policy now, but maybe in the near future. Is that something you can live with?
Yes. I think that it's more important to commit and schedule getting it done than trying to do it this year. And I understand that the budget doesn't include that for this year.
Other questions? Well, thanks for your participation in this process. Your experience is valuable. We have some troublemakers in the back of the room that we'd like to clear out. So we're going to suspend this hearing for about 10 or 15 minutes. For those that are on the YouTube link up, we will reconvene in about 15 minutes, and the temporary modifications final action will schedule about 1:30. So if you need to go find some lunch in the meantime, you have an idea of when we'll take that up. It won't be before 1:30.
Right, it won't be before 1:30, that's right. And so I did want to do a check-in. There were a couple of people, well, really just division staff who are here for the discharger specific variance hearing, who were wanting to attend the groundwater summit this afternoon, but so you'll want them to stick around for a little bit longer, if that's okay.
Yeah,
Right,
sorry that we're overlapping.
no problem. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take about a 15-minute Well, thanks for your indulgence, but we didn't want those people to hang around. You never know what they're going to do. Next, we'll have some remarks from Metro Wastewater.
You guys gave me a tough act to follow. Well, good afternoon. I'm Christine Jocham of Brownstein Hyatt Farber-Schreck, and I swear to tell the truth. I'm here providing testimony on behalf of Metro Wastewater Reclamation District. First off, I'd just like to thank the Commission for providing stakeholders with the opportunity to provide some oral testimony on the proposed revisions to the Commission Policy 13-1, in case you forgot what we were talking about. And also for the division to consider and revise a proposal based on our written comments. I think a lot of things have been addressed completely. The current version of the policy represents a significant revision that involved a great deal of time and energy by everybody involved. So thank you for that. Metro commends the division for involving stakeholders in the process, in the redevelopment process of this policy. And as Barbara explained during her presentation and Gabe mentioned, prior to developing the revisions, the division met with permittees who had gone through the DSV process previously. Metro's comment on this point is just that during the development of future policies, we'd like to encourage the division to invite all stakeholders to participate, even if they haven't gone through the particular process being discussed in the policy. We believe that this would help expedite and streamline the review process and lead to fewer revisions prior to the hearing. Because we had a significant amount of revisions that had to be done before the final was submitted to you. Excuse me. Second, we know that the division is currently in discussions with EPA about how to implement certain provisions of the DSV program, but we'd like to ask the Commission to encourage the creation and development of a division-specific DSV implementation policy, similar to what Gabe suggested during his testimony. A division implementation policy would provide additional clarity to entities considering a DSV about how the application and review process will work, and would help them better understand the timing of the process. An implementation policy could also provide additional clarification on how entities could avoid enforcement actions while they are considering and then going through the DSV process. And finally, a division implementation policy could also elaborate on how the division will endeavor to review DSV applications in a coordinated and streamlined manner. You've heard lots of discussions today about the cost and timing of the whole process, and we believe that the more coordinated we can be, the more efficient the process will be, which will reduce the cost for everyone, including the division. In part, developing a division implementation policy could help identify these and other efficiencies. So again, thank you for the opportunity to provide oral comments on the proposed revisions, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions for Metro? Thank you very much. Thanks. Next, we'll hear from Parker Dominion Water and Sanitation Districts. You have up to 7 minutes. Thank you very much. We like that comment. Any last questions for the division or any of the other parties? Any public comment? Yes, Kevin?
Can we just confirm that all the parties received these proposed updates and that they're entered into the record?
Yeah, so I can confirm that they're entered into the record. We got an electronic version of the division supplement to the revised proposal and added it to the Google Drive this morning. So we just got it this morning, so we weren't able to email anyone or make copies. And then same with South Platte Water Renewal Partners, just got it now. So I guess the question more is for you all. Is there anybody who didn't receive a copy, is concerned and wants to see it before we move forward? Okay.
Or wants to address any of it specifically?
Right. Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments before we move on? we'll take a motion to close the record. And a second. We have a motion from Kevin and a second from Fred to close the record. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. 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 Any opposed? Motion carries. The record is closed. Deliberation. Are there any concerns that anybody wants to express about where we are in this process?
I guess looking at South Platte Renewal Partners proposal here, I don't know how whether it matters or not, but I don't see any problem with adding this statement in that in some cases a DSV site-specific standard or temporary modifications may be more appropriate. Seems like it's just laying out the options available. So I guess my comment is that I think that's reasonable.
See heads. Any other comments under deliberation? My question is, do we want to take final action now? There have been a number of corrections and wording that have been flying back and forth. Is it better to take preliminary action now and finalize all that, or do we want to take final action today?
So I'm going to say this and look at the division at the same time to see how the heads nod, which is I think that we're close enough with where we are as long as we get clarity on which of these pieces of the anti-degradation language you want to adopt. The rest of it's pretty straightforward. We would take the division's revised proposal with the changes in their supplement, add that first part of the South Platte Water Renewal Partners language, it seems like, and then decide on which of the footnotes for anti-degradation limits you prefer. And that would be, I think, good enough that we could take final action today.
Hearing that, is there a motion for final action on the revision to policy 13.1?
Well, can I make one comment?
Sure.
Just as part of the deliberations part of it. The suggestion by two folks related to guidance for implementation and permits and the recognition that that's not in the division's budget this year. I do think that that is something that would be helpful, although it doesn't necessarily belong in a final action document. But I just wanted to comment that I agree that that would be helpful.
I just wanted to say I agreed with Kevin's comment that I didn't think there was, I thought that the Littleton or South Platte Water Renewal Partners comments to section 6.A, Roman numeral 6A were good. Also with regard to the alternative footnotes regarding anti-degradation versus a DSV alternatives analysis, trying to read this from the perspective of not somebody that reads regulations day in and day out. I think the South Platte Water Renewal Partners one is more lay reader friendly, if you will.
Any other comments? Is there a motion for final approval?
Okay, so what I have is that there would be a motion that the commission adopt the proposed revisions to policy 13-1 as proposed by the division in its revised proposal and as refined in the division's supplement to the revised proposal and further refined by the South Platte Water Renewal Partners Exhibit A.
So moved.
Second? It's been moved by Barbara, seconded by Joan to take final action on the revisions to policy 13-1 as Tricia described. Any further discussion?
So I'm just want to clarify, which footnote are we making final? Okay, on the South Platte Renewal Partners? Yes. Okay.
Any other discussion or questions? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion on policy 13-1 is approved. Thank you very much for your good work and for all the stakeholders' involvement in this process. We're going to move on to administrators' items. First, we have approval of the December 10th summary of proceedings and motions. Any questions or comments?
I have a comment in accordance with what you pointed out to me, Commissioner Hum, which is that it probably is important to clarify in the summary that your action, the Commission's action on the temporary modifications rulemaking hearing was preliminary final action. It was just a little bit more vague than we typically are, so we will make that correction.
Any other comments or questions? Is there a motion to approve the summary proceedings with that amendment? Moved by Kevin, seconded by Barbara. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. The summary motions and proceedings are approved for December 10th. Then we have final approval of the new temporary modifications and revisions to current temporary modifications of water quality standards expiring on or before December 31st, 2020, considered in the December 18th rulemaking.
Yep. So thank you. So after the Commission's preliminary final action in December, we did send out prepared draft final action documents, sent those out to all of the parties. We did receive 2 sets of corrections. One was from Frisco and the other from Climax. So the first order of business would be to have a motion to reopen the record for the limited purpose of accepting into the record the draft final action documents and the corrections received.
Is there a motion to reopen the record? Moved by Fred. Is there a second? Second by Jane to reopen the hearing. We'll accept the final action documents and the comments from Climax and Frisco. Tricia, you want to describe what your recommendation is to do with those comments?
Sure. Thank you. So the comments from Frisco were a request to explicitly state that the report that the Commission has requested be shared with the stakeholders be provided in a written format. And we thought that made sense, that was in accordance with the Commission's direction. And so the final action documents in your packets already include that additional change. Climax's comments noted that if we thought it was if the Commission thought it was appropriate to state in the statement of basis and purpose language the Commission's intent to send a letter to ATSDR regarding encouraging them to finalize the toxicological information on molybdenum. My recollection and my notes showed that we actually specifically talked about that during deliberations and decided it was something that was not appropriate to include in statement of basis and purpose language, and so their final action documents do not include that. And that's it. And I talked with Climax and they were understanding of that.
Thank you. Any further questions or discussions before we reclose the hearing? Is there a motion to reclose the hearing? Moved by Fred, seconded by Joan to reclose the hearing. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. The record is reclosed. Any further deliberation? So we have 2 recusals on this, so we will need 3 motions. So first, we'll have a motion on the consideration of temporary modifications for Blue River Segment 14, which is Colorado UC BL 14 and Regulation 33, which will remain unchanged with the language proposed and amended in the statement of basis and purpose. Is there a motion to take final action on this piece of the temporary modifications? Moved by Kevin, seconded by Jane to approve the remaining temporary modification in the language on the basis and purpose. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. That amendment to Regulation 33 is approved.
Just for the record, we'll note that Commissioner Menzer is abstaining.
Thank you very much. I meant to say that. Next, we'll consider final action to delete the selenium temporary modification on Boulder Creek, Segment 8, known as Coal Creek, in Regulation 38. Is there a motion for approval to delete this selenium temporary modification? Moved by Joan. Is there a second? Second by Kevin. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Motion carries with Jane abstaining. The final motion then is for consideration of the commission final action to adopt the remaining changes to Regulation 32 through 38 as proposed by the division in the final action documents, including the proposed statements of basis and purpose language. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Barbara. Seconded by Fred. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The motion carries. The final action and changes to these regulations is approved. Next, we have a draft letter to ATSDR regarding molybdenum. Are there any comments or questions regarding this draft letter?
Yes, I have one. I had one, I thought the letter was great, and I'm glad that we moved forward with doing that. I did have one comment on, it's the it's in the second paragraph. That's where it says, as you know, however, exposure to molybdenum through drinking water can cause serious human health problems. Mm-hmm. I think if we added a few words that said above certain concentrations or something like that, at elevated concentrations.
Mr. Chair and Jane, I had the exact same thought. That sentence needs to be massaged pretty seriously, I think. I mean, the whole part of the point of the letter is that we don't know the answer there, at least not at the level of scientific understanding that we want. So I agree with Jane.
Good point. So, Joan, did you have thoughts beyond what Jane mentioned as maybe some additional clause language at the end? I think that's what you were.
I just figured the division was in a better position than I am to massage that statement, so I didn't work on it.
Okay, no problem. Are we signing on the letter? Or is it just no, it's a letter from the commission. Jeremy drafted it. We ran it by the division, by Christy, in the department, and so we can work on it and get back with Christy too about any thoughts that she might have about how to tweak it.
Other comments or questions? The letter can also be updated to include Jill Hunziger Ryan as the executive director, replacing the question marks in the carbon copy at the bottom. Since that question is tentatively answered at least, and pending confirmation. And hum is simpler than you've got it there. It just has one M in it. Yeah, that's why. Any other questions? I'll entertain a motion to approve the letter as discussed and finalize it. Is there a motion? Sure. So moved. Moved by Kevin. Is there a second? Seconded by Troy to approve the letter with the comments suggested here and apply a signature and send it off.
Do we want to wait till the government's open? Yeah.
No. Fill up the box.
Yeah. It's going to take equally long for them to respond.
Yeah, they're going to get stuck in a pile.
Okay, we have a motion and a second.
Either way, it's going to get stuck in a pile.
Did we vote? I don't think we voted. All in favor, say aye. 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 Any opposed? The motion carries. The letter is approved in substance. We'll have it updated and send it off. Thank you very much. Next, we have a review of a draft resolution regarding Good Samaritan legislation. Are there questions or comments concerning the language proposed?
So as you pointed out, Commissioner, to me, I was going to very transparently, share that I obviously borrowed heavily from a Western Governors Association resolution, and he noted that I failed to take the footer off, so it was even more transparent than I intended. So one change for sure that is needed is to take that off.
I noticed that the tone of this is from state government, trying to protect state government and local government entities that might benefit from it. I think it also makes sense to include the nonprofit community, Trout Unlimited and others that does very good mine reclamation work. So I think that that should be incorporated, which is not in there now. And I think based on our conversations this morning with the mine land reclamation people, there may be some other thoughts that they would like to share with us, incorporate this into this resolution.
Yeah.
Is there general agreement with that?
I agree.
No, I didn't. Mm-mm.
I don't think we should limit it to nonprofits, though. I mean, there's potential for for-profit companies to do the same thing. So I think just other entities.
It says private parties, which I read very broadly, so maybe that could just be nuanced.
What does it say? Nope, you're in the right part. It's in number 5.
Maybe just a catch-all and others like that, so
right.
So maybe replace private with other and other parties. So that way it's private and nonprofit, or do you want to specifically call out nonprofit and then and other parties?
I would like to see the nonprofit community called out. So I think nonprofit and other parties makes sense.
Does that replace volunteer citizens?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Yeah, because there are some volunteer. I know in the Upper Snake, there was a group that did a good deal of work up there. So the question is, how do we want to move this forward? I think that it makes sense to revise this some, but I also think it makes sense to work with mine land reclamation and see what they have to say. Do we want to approve this in concept today and then have Tricia work with others and finalize it, send out a final version and let people just respond by email? Is that something that we can do legally?
Oh, no.
That may present an open meetings problem if we're all communicating by email and not complying with open meetings. So what I would suggest is maybe Tricia can send a message to all of you, but basically blind copy all the commissioners. So when you respond, it goes only to Tricia. If that's how you want to proceed with that.
And so just so I'm clear, what you'd be suggesting is we'll go ahead and make the changes we've talked about. I would send it to DRMS for any other input and then recirculate it amongst commissioners for final approval so that we would have approval. Okay, that's fine.
Commissioners.
Yeah, and I mean, the only other thing I would say is if we wanted to avoid that, we could just bring it to your next meeting, but it is 2 months away and yeah. Mm-hmm.
Everybody comfortable with the process as described?
Yes, I have a question though.
Do we want to, yes, go ahead, Kevin.
So the way this is written, it's just a statement. Where does this go? And
right. Well, actually, so that brings up
distributed?
2 things, but I'll answer your question first, and because I wanted some direction on that as well. Initial discussion with Rick was that we would certainly send it to all of the Colorado delegation, but if you have thoughts on elsewhere that might be helpful, definitely interested in that.
And sent as with an attached cover letter that says, this is our
Attached, please find the Water Quality Control Commission's adopted resolution on Good Samaritan legislation. Something pretty simple like that.
Okay.
Local governments do a lot of resolutions on things that they take positions on, and typically the resolutions are formatted with findings and conclusions, and then a resolution with a single paragraph that has what we're resolving as our position. So we may want to reformat it so it looks more like that. And then I think it would be sent with a brief cover letter that says find the resolution adopted by the Water Quality Control Commission is attached.
Okay.
Make sense?
And then do you want it to be signed by you, that cover letter?
Sure.
Okay.
Why not?
I know how to prepare it.
Okay, so do we have a motion to approve this in concept to be revised and redistributed?
So moved.
Moved by Jane. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Barbara. So we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Thanks for bringing this to our attention, Fred. I think this is a good thing to do. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. We will finalize the resolution and distribute. For information, you've got a draft March 2019 agenda. I will call to your attention that the 303D listing methodology is on the agenda. For those of you that have not been through this cycle, that is a rather meaty and serious document. There aren't a lot of changes that have been going on. I've been sitting in on the stakeholder meetings on this, so there aren't a lot of changes, but there is a tremendous amount of wealth of knowledge in that document. So I would urge you to take your vacation month of February and read it.
Yeah.
Anything else that you'd like to talk about in terms of the March meeting?
Well, not necessarily with respect to the March meeting, but could I have a moment just talk about long range schedule question? On the long range schedule, you can see that April was a very light meeting. The only thing on your calendar is a triennial review informational hearing for the Dillon Reservoir Control Reg and nothing else. Obviously, other things could come up. Adjudicatory hearings could come up, things from the legislative session or other rulemaking or other issues. But in light of that, I did reach out to them, both the division and the watershed group, and ask if they would be amenable, like what their thoughts were. And they are not planning to propose that a rulemaking hearing be scheduled. They don't have, big issues, and we're definitely open to rescheduling. So we don't have any finalization of that, but probably we would move it to May. I don't think we'll get it crosswise in the triennial review. Maybe we're 1 month behind where we technically are supposed to be, but I think the risk is extraordinarily low of any ramifications. Yeah. So I wanted to check in with you if you guys would want us to go ahead and reschedule that for likely May, and then at least at this point tentatively plan to not have either a February or an April meeting. Yeah. So please do keep February. I think at this point is safe. Go ahead and plan that it's canceled. April, please still kind of keep that as a hold on your calendars just in case something comes up. And I'll let you know as soon as I hear of anything, and I'm not anticipating anything, but just in case.
So is this a partial commission shutdown? Any questions for Tricia on the March meeting or on the long range schedule? And just so you plan your travel plans, we'll have March and May meetings here, and we'll be in Grand Junction in June. Gee, sorry, you don't get to do that 5.5-hour drive. Okay, anything else?
Your neighborhood this time.
Are there any commissioner items?
I have one. On March 12th, since the hearing's not supposed to go over to the next day. I thought some of this group might be interested in an E. coli symposium that's being put together with the support from the division, Colorado Stormwater Council, and Urban Drainage and Flood Control District. Just a one-day symposium information exchange with some Colorado case studies related to E. coli implementation, some case studies from Southern California, some information on microbial source tracking, and hopefully some talks by both EPA Region 8 and some of the division staff.
If they're working.
If they're working, if we could ask them if they can commit to coming because they can't answer their email.
We can always
But I think it might be, if you're in town, it might be of interest. They'll be at the Arvada Center. So. Tammy Allen.
Thanks, Jen.
Tammy Allen is who's putting that together. You probably know.
Other commissioner items. Division Director's report.
Thanks, Rick. A few things to cover with you all. I know I have the standing items on there, and I think all of these are covered within that. I'll start out with just some new administration items. As you've heard, we do have a executive director and executive director for CDPHE, Jill Hunsaker-Ryan. She's coming to us from Eagle County, where she was a commissioner. She'd also had quite a big experience with public health. I think some 20 years of experience in public health. Also working here at CDPHE during part of that time. So we're excited for her to start her new role. Her first working day will be the 28th of January. I have not heard when her confirmation hearing will be. So as that information comes together, we'll try and get that out to you all. In addition, obviously, Martha has now retired. It's great that she's getting this kind of farewell tour. I mean, if anybody is deserving of it, she certainly is. All the effort that she's put in towards the commission and to the state is obviously remarkable, and I'm happy to see that. I don't have any further information on whether she will be replaced or how she will be replaced. As that information becomes available, we'll provide that to you all as well. I would anticipate, given that Ms. Hunsaker-Ryan she has some environmental experience, but not a whole lot, that she would likely want to have an environmental programs director, but that'll obviously be her call. So when that information comes, we'll keep you informed. In addition to that, clearly we have the new administration with Governor Polis just taking the helm last week, and a new legislature. It will be an interesting year. We're already starting to see a number of bills coming before us that we've had in fiscal review, so I can't comment on them because it's confidential until they have actually hit the floor. But as we get bills coming forward that impact water quality, certainly we'll keep you all informed of that as well. And then finally, from division personnel standpoint, unfortunately she left a bit early, but Ellen Howard Kutzer is leaving the permits section. She's going back to be an attorney. So she'll be going to Western Resource Advocates in Boulder. She'll start that job in, I think, 2 weeks. This week is her last week here at the division, but I think she's taken like a week or 2 weeks of vacation before she starts the next job. We will be working to backfill her position. Nicole Rowan, unfortunately, is out. She had a death in the family, so she couldn't be here today, but she's already working on the position description and trying to get that advertised, and we're going to be pushing to fill that as soon as possible. Obviously a key role for the division. So that's all the personnel updates that I have. A few other items, kind of some standing ones and then some new ones. First, the standing ones, Colorado Springs, MS4 litigation. We're still working with the the city, EPA, DOJ, Lower Arkansas Conservancy District, and City of Pueblo to try and come up with a settlement on that. Those settlement talks have been ongoing and have been progressing. Unfortunately, you have a federal government shutdown, so I don't have any DOJ or EPA folks that have been engaged, and certainly they will need to be. So those talks have been hampered by that a bit. Hopefully we can get back on track with those. Similarly, the optimization of corrosion control treatment issue involving Denver water and the lead in water. We've been very involved in the stakeholder process with that. EPA had been very engaged with us, not so much in the last month. So again, we're hoping that they get back on track and we can make sure and run whatever the potential alternatives may be through them. One thing I did want to update with respect to that is, we started out, and it wasn't an order by the division that we start with a 3 parts per million dosage of orthophosphate. That was the industry standard, and it's the position that Denver Water was originally reviewing. Based on their studies, we are now down to 1 part per million as the potential optimization for that orthophosphate. In addition, something that may have national implications is typically you start high and then you dose lower when you start dosing for orthophosphate. They've been able to show through their data and the pilot testing that they've been doing that actually starting lower and then increasing up to whatever you think is the optimal amount is as effective, if not more effective, than hitting it with a higher dose, which is great for us because it, again, may be able to demonstrate why a lower dosage would be more important, more appropriate. And they are pilot testing now, I think, at 0.5 and 0.25, whatever that math works out, 2 parts per million. If they can get down to 0.5, that'll be roughly the stream standard. Because, for orthophosphate, it's a 3-to-1 relationship. So it'd be 1 part of phosphorus in that. So it would be pretty close to the Reg 85 or Reg 6, however those work, 31 and 85 limits that we have for nutrient loading for the state. So that would be significant. Even still, though, we want to try and reduce phosphorus as much as we possibly can. And we very much appreciate the input of Metro, Denver Metro, and others, the Greenway Foundation, that have been pushing for additional nutrient reductions. And we will abide by that and continue to work with them and have as much of a nutrient reduction as we possibly can. Even to include a ban on phosphorus within the state for certain commercial products, which I think I mentioned to you previously with respect to lawn fertilizer and detergents. Yep, and there's not a ban. Nope. And the interesting thing is, a lot of states do have bans, and we've been working with them to see how that has affected the phosphorus loading in their respective states. And it's very, I think we're very hopeful that could help us reduce the amount of phosphorus that we have. Because of that, though, there's a lot of detergent companies, that sell to a wide variety of states that have already removed the phosphorus from their detergents, but for commercial operations, they have not. So that may be, that may be something where a phosphorus ban could potentially help. So we'll be looking at that as well.
Colorado actually talked about a phosphorus ban in detergents when the Dillon control rate was first adopted, and
This is why you can't leave, Bart. The information that you have is.
But like Procter and Gamble and SC Johnson, the manufacturers just came out of the wood.
Okay. Great.
In Summit County, we did a huge education campaign.
I remember that's when you and I first met. That's when you were a commissioner.
Phosphorus in Lake Dillon and the impacts the detergents and fertilizers have, and I think it's very effective. But we're dealing with a much smaller population.
Sure.
that is
And a really
environmentally
motivated
sensitive.
population.
But
It's a different area.
Yeah.
It is.
California's banned it.
Yeah,
so-
exactly. Yeah, I don't think the big guys would come out.
I wouldn't anticipate it as well in terms of the big commercial manufacturers. Now, with respect to fertilizer, perhaps they will, but I mean, my staff has been able to track down that, what's the big Scott's? They have already removed it from many of their commercial products. So, you know, maybe not. Maybe there won't be the opposition.
No, I don't, yeah.
And we could still, you know, achieve some benefits from having that ban. So we're looking at every alternative in terms of nutrient reduction and particularly limiting the impact that the OCCT determination may have on the watersheds. And the last couple of things I wanted to hit on, there is a new waters of the state definition that EPA put out. Waters of the United States.
Yeah.
Thank you. Not for Colorado. Which is a big distinction. Yeah. Cooperative dictatorialism. No, it is waters of the U.S. definition that EPA has put out. I do not think it's gone into the Federal Register yet. Yeah.
It has, there's been a pre-published version that has been floated, but it has not shown up in the Federal Register yet.
And they had also indicated that they wanted to have some town halls around the U.S. before they actually publish it, but those were supposed to be scheduled and ongoing now. So, yeah, indeed. So, I mean, I think it's fantastic. One of the silver linings to what's an otherwise awful situation for our federal partners. But once that is final, we will review the state's position. We've already been working with Department of Ag, Department of Natural Resources, and the governor's office, as well as the Attorney General's office, to get a feel for the direction that they may want to take. The Western Governors Association, the Western States Water Council, of which I'm a member, has already taken positions on it that are not necessarily supportive. So, you know, we will continue to pursue that. And as, you know, something is finalized and actually once it gets published, you know, certainly we will look at whether or not the state wants to take a position in opposition to that. And the other one was the groundwater under the influence, or surface water under the influence of groundwater, however you want to put it, the groundwater conduit theory, which allows EPA regulation of pollutants to groundwater that daylight in surface water. There's a split right now in the circuits, and we are reviewing that issue as well in terms of whether or not the state should comment or do an amicus brief or get involved in that litigation. So as that issue progresses, you know, we'll keep you all informed on that as well.
In the case in Hawaii where they're injecting untreated wastewater into wells and presumably it's then getting into the oceans.
It's highly treated
It's highly treated. Okay, excuse me, I stand corrected. But in that case, is the ocean considered waters of the U.S.?
Yeah, the coastal zone would be.
Yep. Okay, I've just been curious.
Yep.
Questions for Patrick? Anything else, Patrick?
Nope, that was it.
Do we want to take a break before we get Jerry's report?
Lengthy report.
Attorney General's report.
On that note, I have nothing.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes, we do. And a new Deputy Attorney General for Natural Resources and the Environment.
And we also have a new director of the Department of Natural Resources that happens to be a Summit County Commissioner. Right. So the mountain communities are finally taking over state government.
And actually the ag commissioner's from Durango. So, yep. I can't remember her name. She was just appointed. She was appointed 2 weeks before CDPHE.
Oh, I missed that one.
Yep.
So I saw the first big batch.
Yeah, the first female ag commissioner.
Oh, is she in that batch? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, because I saw that. Because I might have been at a party with the new executive director of the Department of Regulatory Agencies the day before that one,
Oh,
or
wow.
a couple of days before that one.
Oh, nice.
Any further business? We'll stand adjourned. Thank you very much.
It's not like it's something I've never heard of.
Joan, are you meeting with Ron? I am. Okay, you have a place in town. We're just gonna be cafeteria. Okay. Yeah, I'm just talking to him about. Yes, yeah. Well, and then, yeah, I mean, I think all of the issues, he'll talk about just since you are kind of talking about it. Right.